The first few things we have to say are not super important, so we'll just go ahead and get started. It is welcome. Thank you for joining us, and very sorry for the 8 a.m. start. Calendars are difficult, but we will definitely try to avoid that in the future. My name is Heather Moline. I'm an energy policy advisor to the commissioners at the Utilities and Transportation Commission, UTC. And we are very grateful you all are here for our first of the year, Spring 2025 Washington State Resource Adequacy Meeting, co-sponsored by UTC and the Washington State Department of Commerce. I am joined today by our commissioners, Chair Brian Ryberick, Commissioner Ann Rendall, Commissioner Milt Dumit, and Glenn Blackman, Director of the State Energy Policy Office, as well as fellow Energy Policy Advisor Peyton Swinford, and Austin Scharf, Senior Energy Policy Specialist from Commerce, is also here. And thank you very much to our AV team, Shannon Stewart from UTC, and others helping make this meeting happen today. Some participation etiquette. Please mute yourself and turn off your camera when not in a speaking role. The chat feature is available in Zoom for technical issues and question and answer. There's closed captioning available at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the control bar. And the raise hand function. Brian, I think you need to mute there. Thank you. No problem. The raised hand function is actually within the reactions tool at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So when we get to that point, if you'd like to raise your hand, that's where you find the raise hand feature. If you are on the phone today, you dial *9 to raise and lower your hand, *6 to mute and unmute, and we ask that everyone please remain muted unless speaking. If you are sharing while on the phone, when we call on you, we'd like you to provide your first and last name and who you are representing, whether that be an organization or if you're a member of the public or a customer of a certain utility, that would be great. There is a sign-in sheet for those of you here in person. Thank you for joining us. Again, wicked early, I apologize. The sign-in sheet is outside the door, so please make sure you sign in before you leave. If you are here on Zoom, we ask that you, I believe it's you right-click your name and rename yourself with your first and last name. And if you're representing anyone, such as an organization, member of the public, customer of a certain utility, etc. Restrooms are out these doors and to your left. We will have a question and answer session after each panel. We will have a public comment section after the second panel. We ask that we avoid interrupting other speakers. Please only use the chat feature for technical assistance and questions. Questions may be asked live during Q&A or can be shared through chat at any time. Questions in the chat will be answered potentially in writing on an ongoing basis if we have an immediate answer to your question, or live at the appropriate time in the agenda, or possibly via response after this meeting, potentially within our meeting summary that we plan to send out, which we'll talk about later. And we ask you to get as close as is humanly possible to your mic. That will help everyone here today. Thank you. So this is an abbreviated agenda that was on the Resource Adequacy website, the Commission's Resource Adequacy website, as well as shared to the docket. We're about to start with introduction and opening comments. Then we'll go to a panel on statewide and regional perspectives on summer readiness. That's a topic for today. We'll have a little break. Then we'll have a second panel on utility perspectives on summer readiness. We'll have another little break, public comment section, closing comments, and then we will adjourn. So here's our little intro just to make sure we're all in the right place. Resource adequacy in general, there are exceptions to this, means having enough electric resources available to meet expected customer needs. RCW, that's Revised Code of Washington, so statute, 19-280-065 requires UTC and Commerce to host at least one resource adequacy meeting per year. This is the first of 3 meetings that we'll host this year, and we're focusing on summer readiness today. Our next meeting is already scheduled for September 22nd, and we will focus on longer-term resource adequacy. We'll say more about that meeting later. We'll have a 3rd meeting in late fall where we will focus on winter readiness. The slides for today are already posted on the UTC Resource Adequacy webpage. We will also be posting a recording of today's meeting and a meeting summary to that webpage and the docket, which is 210096. Now I'd like to turn to some opening comments from our hosts here, starting with Chair Brian Ryberick of UTC.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to abide by your rule of trying to get this as close to my face as humanly possible, but thanks for that introduction. I know resource adequacy issues are on our minds all the time as regulators and as utilities, but I think that comes into increasing focus as we see reports from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and information coming through our integrated resource plan process showing tightening capacity on our system. So as Heather just mentioned, moving this to 3 times a year, I think is a really smart move. So I want to thank staff. I want to thank Glenn and the team at Commerce as well. That was kind of the idea really early in my tenure here to move into that summer readiness, winter readiness, and resource adequacy long term. And as we see in those IRP processes, this convergence of peaks where a winter peaking system and summer peaking, the summer peaks are coming much, much closer to the winter peaks. And so as we see that, I think having this broken out into 3 is really important. And obviously, from this summer perspective, focusing on wildfire issues. And I know we'll have a little bit more specific discussion of that later today as well at our recessed open meeting. Well, maybe not today, but it is feeling a little bit like summer already. And so wildfire issues are front of mind. We see it on the front page of the newspapers with fires burning in Canada already affecting much of the eastern United States, and some small wildfires burning in our region already. And while that may have not been ignited by energy infrastructure, they impact us all and can certainly have an impact on resource adequacy. Indeed, we've seen utilities in Washington enter fire safety mode already, with Avista identifying that they were going into fire safety mode very early this year, much earlier than in years past, given the concerning conditions they're already seeing on the ground. So looking forward to this timely discussion. I know Commissioner Rendall as well is very focused on this issue at the regional and national level. So looking forward to that discussion today. So I'll turn it over to Commissioner Rendall.
Thank you, Chair Ryberick. Really appreciate you all coming here today at 8 a.m. in the morning. Yes, I think we, as Chair Ryberick mentioned, both national and regional studies and experiences have shown us that this issue of resource adequacy, while we're trying to address it through the Western Resource Adequacy Program and looking at it in other ways, is really a critical one. We have not been able to build the resources we need to meet the coming load from the increased demand, and also just a change in resources. And we need to be really mindful of how we are going to meet customers' needs. The peaks come in the summer and the peaks come in the winter, and they have different impacts on our electric and gas systems. And we need to be really mindful going into these. And I appreciate having just come from some conversations in advance of the Western Conference about the coordination that is going on among all the utilities in the region to ensure that when we do come into these peaks, whether summer or winter, that they're working together to address these issues of tightening supply and increasing demand. And so I appreciate folks coming here today to talk about this issue of summer readiness, and then the impact that the risk of wildfires also has on the system. And again, talking later today about our utilities, the utilities that we regulate, and how they are preparing for the summer season. So thanks for being here today. It's a really critical issue, and we have a great lineup. Thank you, Heather and the team, for putting this together. And one other thing I wanted to mention, I think that the increase to these 3 sessions is in direct response to the comments we received after last year's resource adequacy discussions and the need to really focus in on these issues. So I want to thank everyone for their comments that helped us expand this discussion.
There you go.
Thank you. And really not much to add to my colleagues' comments because I think they hit all the high points. Reliability is at the top of our mind right now, and resource adequacy is critically important. And as reflected in the fact we're doing this 3 times, the statute requires us to do it once. That's a lot of work, just the one time. But now, Heather, thank you so much to you and to the staff, to Commerce staff as well for I think properly now having these 3 times a year to address the convergence of peaks in the seasons. It's changing, and this reflects our collective sort of understanding of the importance of resource adequacy. So thank you very much. Look forward to the panels, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm Glenn Blackman with the Department of Commerce. And I'm also happy to welcome everyone here, and I appreciate the UTC hosting. I was planning to take credit for the 8 a.m. start, but since Chair Rabarek already did that, I'll just have to defer to him on that one. I'm really looking forward today to a more operational look at the status of our grid and the resources on the grid. Resource adequacy is typically looking a few years out and seeing how we can build to meet demand. And today we get to look at how things, are going to be this summer. How ready are we in the immediate term? And that's kind of an element of utility and grid operations that we tend to have less visibility into. So I'm really looking forward to getting this status update today. So thank you very much for being here again.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will transition to panel 1. If you're in the room and you're on panel 1, you're welcome to come sit at the front with us. And if you are not in the room on panel 1, if you're on Zoom, bear with me a moment while I pull up our slides from the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. All right, we will turn it over to WEC. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you. We enjoy a great relationship with the state of Washington, and we really appreciate being asked back to share some information this morning. I'm Victoria Ravenscroft. I manage our external affairs and strategy at WEC, and I'm joined by Katie Rogers, who manages our reliability assessments team. We're going to give you a high-level, west-wide overview of what we're looking at in terms of the summer to kind of kick off your proceedings today. So by way of a very quick introduction, if you go to the next slide, for those who are not familiar with what WEC is, we were formerly known as the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. So we are now WEC. We are one of 6 regional entities that is responsible for ensuring the reliability in our footprints. The West is our footprint. And together with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, we formed the Electric Reliability Organization, or ERO Enterprise. So that's a lot of names and a lot of letters, but suffice it to say, we look over the West and help ensure reliability in the Western United States, Canada, and a small little part of northern Mexico. Next slide. There's a lot of information on this slide, kind of some fun facts. One of the key points here, though, is that the entirety, or almost all of the Western Interconnection power system is in the WEC regulatory footprint. And the same is true of Texas, but that's not true of the Eastern Interconnection. And that has some implications for how the system operates and also how it's regulated. Next slide. So our responsibility is kind of twofold. One is to help guide the creation of and then monitor and enforce reliability standards. These are mandatory standards that entities of different registration types are required to follow. But we also have a responsibility to promote activities that ensure the reliability of the bulk power system. And those activities kind of range from studies to education. And on the right, we've got 4 categories, just one way to kind of divide up what we do. The first is that we identify and assess emerging risks. And this is a small sentence and a large responsibility. This takes the bulk of a lot of what we do. And everything we do is centered around risks to the reliability of the bulk power system. Next, we leverage fairly strong analytical and data capabilities to look at the performance of the system. We get a lot of information about how it is performed in the recent and distant past, and try and use that information to determine how it might perform in the future and identify those risks. As I mentioned, we help to develop, monitor, and enforce mandatory reliability standards. The standards regime for the bulk power system anyway, is an industry standards regime. And so we help to develop industry standards, but they are developed and voted on by industry. Once they are approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we have responsibility along with that ERO enterprise to monitor and enforce those standards. And then finally, we do have a mandate to educate and share information. So if you go to, and you can skip on to the next slide, I just want to set the stage a little bit for what Katie's going to talk to you about, which is more specifically the summer outlook, but kind of set the stage as to what we're seeing in some of our work. As I mentioned, risk is central to what we do, and this is a look at our top 5, what we call reliability risk priorities. As you look across these, you'll notice a lot of these have to do with the summer and winter as well, but really have to do with things we are going to experience over the next few months. We prioritize these risks to kind of hone in and focus our sites and our resources and our time on these. And we used to have resource adequacy as one of the risks, and then we realized resource adequacy is in all of these risks. It's in the DNA of every one of these. So next slide. I just want to glance at a couple pieces of analysis work that we have out there to continue to set the stage. The first is our State of the Interconnection. This is that performance analysis work that we've talked about. It's one of the ways we share that information. And the one highlight I want to pull from that is the load growth highlight. These are actual load numbers, so these aren't forecasted numbers. They go back a decade. And the key here is that we are seeing load increase, and that's not news, I think, to anybody, but it's sort of the starkness of that increase. That in the last 5 years alone, 3 of those have broken records for demand. Last year, the annual demand and the peak demand broke records in the Western Interconnection. So this obviously comports with our experience with hot weather and extended heat waves and things of that nature. But it is worth mentioning that this is happening. Our interconnection does peak in the summer. So these are summer peaks, although our winter peak is also catching up. Next slide. Load growth will be the theme here as well. So our Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy, which we released late last year, takes a look at answering really just one question, and that is, will we have enough resources to meet demand over the next decade? And the report goes into more information on that overall. Maybe is kind of the answer that we're giving. There's a lot of caveats to that. And one thing I will stress is that with any of these studies that WEC shares or other people share, we're using the data that we get, and we get that data from entities. And even if that data is perfect, we're still only looking at a couple stars in the heavens. And so the tough part here is to look at those stars and figure out what do they mean. Are we looking at scenarios that are so extreme that they're meaningless? But in no way are we telling the future here. That said, when you see something that happens across multiple scenarios and studies, both at WEC and other places, you start to look for patterns and trends. And one of the greatest patterns and trends we're seeing is the load increase. And we are seeing unprecedented demand growth that comports with other studies that are out there right now. The specific numbers are important, and at the same time, they're not the most important thing. We are seeing a doubling of the forecast load, which means for the same 10-year forecast that we received from entities in 2024, it was double the forecast that we received in 2023 for those same future years. So that's pretty big, and it just indicates that entities are looking at much larger load increases potentially than they were just the year prior. Large loads, this is the headline buzzword. Large loads are the driver of the vast majority of this growth from what we're seeing. So with that, load is sort of on everybody's lips when it comes to the resource adequacy conversation that has really taken center stage. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I guess I have one more. This is always one of interest, if you'll go to the next slide. This is just to give you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of planned retirements and new additions over the next decade. At first glance, this looks like we're going to add a whole lot more than we are going to retire, and by megawatt of installed capacity, that is the case. But if you take a look at what we are retiring, we're retiring a lot of that traditional generation, a lot of coal, some of the natural gas, and then nuclear, if in fact Diablo Canyon is not extended. Its now planned retire date is 2030. So this just gives you an idea of what we're looking at. To meet the load growth over the next 10 years will take an astounding amount of new generation capacity being built. And again, the specific numbers are, those are debatable, but I think most would agree that if our load forecasts for the next 10 years come to fruition, or even close to fruition, we will need to build at a rate we have never built at. Certainly in the Western Interconnection, probably in this country, and probably in most places in the world. So we have a big challenge ahead of us, however we look at it. So I do believe that is my last one, and I'm gonna stop now and let Katie kind of get to the meat of our summer outlook and the work that we have partnered with NERC to do. So.
Victoria, thank you for that. If you don't mind, if you don't mind, a couple of questions before we jump into the other side. On the load forecasting side, a couple questions came to mind as you went through. One, in the historical look, which is a couple slides back, we do see this increase. There was a big dip, it looked like in 2019 timeframe, and then this increase. I just wonder if you can kind of give us a little sense of A, why we saw the dip before this big increase, and two, what that increase is attributed to. I know we'll kind of talk a little bit in a second about going forward, but is that large loads, or is that more electrification loads, et cetera, of what we've seen from the past perspective?
Yeah, and without having too much of the detail in front of me, weather is a huge driver of load. And so where you sort of have your base number that's gonna be needed every year, cooler or more mild years can drop that number fairly substantially. And then in 2019 was just a milder year. You get into 2020 and we had our huge heat dome of the season of the, I believe, September in 2020. And so you see, excuse me, you see that spike there in 2020. And keeping in mind that this is peak demand, so this is that instantaneous, the absolute highest point that we met in that year. And I believe that peak demand is during that September heat dome event. Whereas 2019, we didn't have a big heat event that would have caused that kind of a spike.
Okay, thank you. And then moving on to the forecasting side, obviously it's front of mind for everybody for a lot of the reasons you just mentioned. That if it's all real, that is a more daunting challenge than maybe we've ever taken on. But then the question is, what's real? And so if I'm understanding load forecasting or the load that you're forecasting, this is kind of a bottoms up approach where you're taking all of the entities load forecasts and stitching them together. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yep,
So-
that's correct.
So then I wonder, is there any thoughts or talks of having some independent view of that rather than it just be the forecasts that are stitched up from the entities? I realize they are on the ground. They have a good sense of what that load is. But right now, I think there is this concern that a lot of these interconnection requests are getting made in multiple places. And so there's this potential for double counting. So I just wonder, how is WEC approaching that concern and what are the discussions going on to address that?
That's a central question to this whole large load. Are we over forecasting it, or is it too high? And one of the ways that we are going to address this is to do some load scenarios. So we take the number that we do build bottoms up, and we pull that number back a little bit. We can also push that number higher and take a look and see what happens in both of those cases. The hard part is because, as you mentioned, we have a hunch, but we don't have any hard information that tells us how many states are some of these large load companies filing in, and so how many of those are going to be pulled back when they finally settle on where they're going to build their load, if they build the load at all. And so figuring that out, we're kind of looking into a black box. We are happy to and look for other information on load to help triangulate. And right now we've got folks kind of looking out there to figure out what is a reasonable number to look at other than just the load number that we have aggregated from all of our entity information. So I guess the short story is we are looking to see if other people have answers that we can incorporate into our own work. And at the same time, we are incorporating some sensitivity analysis to see, all right, what if it's not that high? And what if it's higher? So I hope that kind of gets at your question.
It does, and I appreciate that. I'll just say, I think one thing you mentioned there is when we've had load forecasts that have been fairly consistent over years, that being sort of a black box exercise did not seem as concerning. But when we see this, the need to sort of open up that box a little bit more is like front and center on my mind. I don't know exactly how to do that. I appreciate the efforts of doing at least some sensitivity analysis around what you have. But this is an area where I think all of us have an interest in figuring out another path to open up that box, and hopefully it's not Pandora's. But yes.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think what we're facing is not just a shift in load and a shift in the resources, but a mindset shift in how we work and what we accept as the status quo, particularly in the information that we have access to. And a lot of it is behind a veil of whether that's proprietariness or what have you. And so I do think we're facing that mindset shift in how we partner and how we work together to get the information that we need.
Very much agree. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I don't think we can hear you, Katie. I think you were speaking.
Nope.
Nope. It's coming in and out.
And real quick, Katie, will you try to figure that out? I'm recognizing here, we have a good number of state representatives and senators on the line here, and recognizing that this is as much a legislative policy issue in some ways as it is a regulatory policy issue. Do want to afford the opportunity if any of our legislative members want to ask questions along the way, please do feel free to raise your hands as well, and we'll get you in the queue. And thank you all for joining.
No luck.
You may want to call in and instead of using the audio through Zoom, use it through your phone. Just as thought.
Are there any other questions at this point for Victoria?
To wrap, just
Okay. Perhaps we will jump ahead if our folks from Western Resource Adequacy Program and Western Power Pool are already awesome. Let me go ahead and pull up that. Or are you presenting your own slides? Okay. Okay.
You can turn on your mic too. That would be great.
Okay, I think we're good. I'm Rebecca Sexton. I'm the Director of Strategic Engagement and Communications at the Power Pool. It's good to see all of you again. And I recognize that I think one of my prompts was to help respond to Katie's portion of the presentation. So we'll do this a little, surprise, Katie, you get to respond to my portion of the presentation. But anyway, I have for you today just kind of a very high level reminder of what RAP is. I know many of you and many folks in the room are well familiar, so apologies to those of you. You can tune out for a minute, and then we'll talk about kind of a status update about RAP going binding and kind of what the summer looks like for us. We are in a non-binding state, so we don't have metrics to release publicly per se, but we can talk generally about the experience that folks are having and what the program is working towards, as well as kind of the differences between what we see in, say, the summer readiness assessment from NERC and WEC versus what we kind of experience in the RAP space. Okay. So a reminder that the RAP is a voluntary resource adequacy program. It's basically a voluntary compliance program that is joined by, we call them LREs, but it's load responsible entities. It's kind of a flexible approach to participation, but that is mainly participation by utilities. So we have two time horizons, planning and operations. And the idea here is that when we all are planning together, we can lower the total capacity need for the region, so long as in the operations time horizon, folks can access each other's pooled capacity to realize the diversity benefits there. So the value proposition of RAP is that if we do this in a binding way, in a way that everybody's obligated to show up with the right amount of capacity, one, by setting those metrics and requiring that people show up with their fair share of the capacity, that we send the right market signals for folks to procure capacity. So if we know we have a potential problem, we need to make sure that people are motivated to do their part in fixing it from a market perspective. And then in the binding operations program, that's ensuring that folks do show up when they're called upon for their neighbors, to help their neighbors. So the other pieces here are setting a common analytically derived reliability metric. We'll talk about that, but at this point, it's setting a monthly planning reserve margin for 9 months of the year. So we have 2 seasons, winter and summer. Summer runs June 1 through September 15, and each of those months gets a different reserve margin set analytically for that year specifically. So taking all of the resources that participants turn in and setting a metric. The idea, of course, is that we're leveraging that load and resource diversity to serve reliability. Our current participation in RAP is in the dark, looks black. I think it's kind of gray. And then, of course, the other, the yellow up there is other WPP programs that folks participate in. So we're serving for RAP the majority of the WEC outside of California. We do expect that we'll have some additional participants. We're kind of in the midst of our first onboarding of new participants since the tariff was approved in 2023. So this is kind of a new world for RAP to bring in new folks. Okay, so a reminder here of the 2 time horizons. In the forward showing, we have this determination of the capacity requirement. So we're looking at all of the resources, folks turn them in 2 and 5 years in advance. And the program operator run by SPP at this time is determining the program capacity requirement. So they're looking at all the resources and all the loads that folks turn in. And so there's big, caveat there with the conversation we're having about the need to have more information about load forecasting and kind of the uncertainty there. That certainly plays a large role in all of the conversations about RA. But we're determining how much capacity we need in the region, and then we allocate it out to all of the participants as a forward showing capacity requirement. Then we take all of their resources and we say, given the nameplate resource that you bring and the type of resource that it is, here's how much perfect capacity, if you will, that would count for. So you might bring 100 megawatts of a wind farm and we'd say that counts for 30 megawatts of capacity. Or you bring 100 megawatts of hydro and maybe it counts for 85. And so depending upon the resource type, there's different methodology to determine what the capacity value to the system is based on how it's historically performed in the hours where it was needed. So then everybody's turning those portfolios in and we're doing the compliance review. Did you bring enough? So this is the check on, did everybody have their fair share, either in their owned resources or in contracts for other resources. And if you do not, then when we're in a binding version of the program, there will be charges, non-compliance charges. Of course, those are phased in a bit during the transition, and I'll talk about that in a second. In the operations program, very simply, we look at what we said based on modeling. We know that it's not going to be correct. It's a lot of assumptions. So we look at the forward showing expectations we had. Everybody turns in their reality in the operating time horizon. We look at the delta. So you might have, hopefully most days, you don't need everything that we told you might need. And you have a little extra, but on the worst of days, you might need help. And so the delta between those is how much you can access from the pool or how much you might owe to someone else out there. And that's done depending on the region. In the Northwest, it's done on a pro rata basis for whoever has some surplus relative to their sharing or their original forward showing. So if they had surplus in the forward time horizon, we don't access that part. We just access sort of the fair share that they brought to the program. Okay, so that's the high level. There's a tariff, there's a couple 100 pages of business practices, but we'll skip through all of that and then talk briefly about the revised transition plan and some of the current status of the RAP. So last year, around this time, we were kind of embarking on a conversation with RAP participants about the transition time horizon. So way back when, you will recall, we started this conversation in 2019. The issue was there was a lot of uncertainty about how deep the market would be. An expectation that on your worst of days, you might be able to call someone. That was a very reasonable expectation, maybe a decade ago, that you could call and get energy. That was the most cost-effective way to serve load. A concern round about 2018, 2019, maybe even a little earlier, that how responsible was that? So at that time, it's no surprise here that we were not thinking about the kind of load growth we're talking about this morning. So sort of a different dynamic and a different paradigm, but nevertheless, we had expected that we might go binding with this program as soon as 2024, I think, back in the day. Last year, we had this conversation about what's really reasonable with all of the new dynamics out there for folks to transition into a binding version of the program. So as of right now, participants are giving data to us and to SBP as program operator. They're going through all of the activities related to the showing and to the operations program, but there's no operations sharing happening. So, if we're calculated to be surplus, there's no obligation to help anyone else. During those events, you can raise a hand and ask for help if you need to, but it's much more kind of casual, non-binding. And then in the forward showing time horizon, they're doing the exercise of turning in the resources. We're going through the exercise of validating them. They get letters from us saying, you were able to pass this round, or we didn't have enough information to tell you whether you passed or not. You really need to supply, all the bits and pieces. And so the conversation last summer was, let's talk about what a reasonable timeline is to potentially get this program to binding. And so now the default is everyone moving to a binding version of the program for winter 27-28. Everybody has the obligation basically to stay in the program and participate in that winter 27-28 if they don't tell us before October 31st, 2 years in advance, that they are leaving the program. So there's no more non-binding option. It's sort of rubber meets the road decision making this year. If there's in the program, then of course we can have a conversation with them, say in January of next year is the current tariff expectation, about whether they might want to go binding in summer 27. So that's an option to go one season earlier. But the default is winter 27-28, these discounted deficiency charges, and then starting that sharing and that operations program would be undertaken. So we filed that with FERC. It was approved by FERC in January of this year. And so that's what we're all kind of operating towards, is that winter 27-28 decision or binding. Just kind of talking about where RAP is and the challenges that we as WPP and partnering with participants are kind of experiencing now for the sake of, keeping up to speed. I'd say one of the things that folks are working through, and some of this is business practice, or, we had to get business practices done, and now folks are updating their own internal processes to comply with the demonstration requirements, but just getting all of the information from participants about resources. It's a little like, you got to stack up your resources, which means you don't have, I can look at some of these up, right? I can literally go on Wikipedia and tell you that this resource exists. I don't think they're making up the resource, but we do require things like operations testing and capability testing. And so they've got to look at historical records. We try to make these things as simple as they can be. It's not like, send someone out with a stopwatch and do something specific with the resource. We really try and use like historical records that you probably are, is the resource still operating? Has it been mothballed and not used for years, et cetera? But getting all of that data into the program operator so things can be fully validated is a pretty significant task for participants. And so that's, I'd say, issue number one is, it's logistical challenges. And then especially with contracts, folks going to each of the sellers of a contract they might be using to meet the RAP requirements and asking them to sign off saying, this is a RAP compliant contract, meaning this is not just energy I intend to procure in the spot market, but I actually have a physical resource associated with this that's not counting towards any other resource adequacy program. That's a non-trivial exercise for people to do in the bilateral space. So that's sort of issue number one we're all collectively working through. Issue number two is insufficient capacity. And so this is kind of coupled with issue number 4, which is the forward showing metric evolution. That kind of relates to load. But insufficient capacity, I'd say on the whole, participants' ability to pass the program is a concern. And so we may, and I think this is one of the larger differences between like studies that WEC and NERC are able to do, looking at kind of the region in aggregate, and then the very discrete who has the rights to which capacity question that RAP is asking. And so we're looking at who has contracted for the capacity and has the rights to that capacity, can to go through all of the validation. So there's, best case scenario, if we're looking at the region and saying it looks like we might have enough capacity, then perhaps there will be a liquid spot market if people didn't have the right amount of forward procured capacity. But in the RAP space, our requirement is that you've actually contracted for that capacity months in advance. And so even if there is kind of enough out there, there's a lot of detail that is commercially sensitive that is hard for a regional scale modeling exercise to capture, right? There might be capacity out there that someone will have on outage. There might be capacity out there that, they aren't comfortable selling down to the wrap planning reserve margin. So they might sell in the spot market in the most positive outlook here, or they might not. And so what we certainly are seeing, and I think it's evidenced by the hesitation to move into a binding version of wrap, is lack of confidence in folks' ability to meet the metrics. And so if you're thinking about joining a voluntary compliance program, there's some risk in your ability to comply. And logically speaking, participants are hesitant to commit to a program if they are not sure if they'll be able to contract for or build the capacity necessary to pass on the timelines we're talking about here. Okay, then 3 is operations program improvements. This is a bit more of an upper. The operations program that we run now is necessarily kind of clunky. So we have in the operations time horizon, we end the wrap obligations at the pre-scheduled day. So our intent here is to kind of finish wrap obligations and hand off duties to the day ahead markets that are kind of coming. That leaves us with we have to kind of leave capacity home, if you will. So if you are a participant and you might need your resources to serve your own load, we can't necessarily count on them to serve someone else's. So there's some amount of inefficiency there necessary because of the timelines we're currently working with. But there's a real opportunity to further integrate with the day ahead markets and potentially utilize some of their optimization and all the way through real time to kind of eke out any other efficiencies with the diversity sharing that the program on its own without the markets has to kind of leave on the table. So that one, I think there's a lot of hope there. And we have a task force we'll talk about in a second that is planned to start July 1 to think specifically about how that can go. And then the last one is the forward showing metrics evolution. We set the metrics, it's very intentional in wrap on an annual basis. So 1 year before they have to comply, participants learn what the forward showing requirement for them will be. If they don't have certainty, as they don't either, about what their load might be, large loads, there's all sorts of ways in which these things can be uncertain. And then we pair with that this very analytically driven, intentionally so, but also sort of surprising, hopefully not, but it could be, planning reserve margin each year. They stay committed and they don't learn what the planning reserve margin is until after they've declared they'll be committed to that season. Because we only run with the people who are in the program, basically. We intentionally said, you can only rely on the folks who are participating in the program. So we need to know who's participating. Then we'll run the metrics based on who's in. And so that uncertainty, I think, causes enough hesitation as folks are deciding to take the leap into a binding version of that program. So both of 3 and 4 are intended for task forces that the group will start talking about. These are things that there's a very stakeholder industry driven process over the last 6 years to build the program. And it's intended to be responsive to what works for participants to participate in a voluntary compliance program. And so it's 2 of the things that we will be further evaluating to make sure, best laid plans aren't shooting us in the foot relative to our ability to get folks into a binding version of a program. So just reminding, I've kind of mentioned this, but we started this in 2019. We've gone through filing a tariff approval in 2023. Now, September 2024, we finished all of the business practices with the detail about how the program gets built. So now we've embarked on this kind of new era for wrap where we are evolving the program and improving upon it. So we knew we were starting with a kind of basic version of an RA program. We've been saying that for years. We really got to get this thing built. And now we're looking at how we can improve the policies to take advantage of new approaches to things like the capacity valuation, or take a different approach to, say, setting the metrics if the ever-changing metrics are not suiting everyone's needs, for instance. And so to do that highly collaborative stakeholder process, basically, I'll just summarize that we take all the concepts from anyone and everyone, and we put them into a work plan. That's been happening over the course of the first couple months here of the year, and the board will approve a work plan, and then we'll start kind of working through those task forces in the next couple of months. Yeah.
Thanks, Rebecca, so much. And you're probably not done, but just a question
Oh, yeah.
while we're on this. Evolving metrics, evolving program, improving
Yes.
program. Okay, I mean, that had to do with the fact that it sounds like from your presentation that there just wasn't the capacity that you would hope for collectively. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say, so we are in a non-binding version of a program. So there's a big caveat on the data that we get from folks that, there's something, I'd say you can kind of put things into three categories. There's capacity that folks turn in that we can fully validate per the rules of the program. So that might mean it's a contract and it's got all the paperwork associated, they checked all the boxes. Or it's a thermal resource that has all of the capacity or capability and operations testing required. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is they turned in capacity, but they didn't check all of the boxes. That might be because they can't. Maybe that's more the case with a contract. If it's really an energy only contract, they're in a negotiation with someone, that's possible. But for the most part, we think when they turn in a resource but don't check all the boxes, it's probably still a real resource, especially if it's, resource specific and not a contract. It's probably still a real resource. And then there's the actual, we have participants who are not, just even if you count all the stuff that doesn't have all of the verified, the second bucket, you combine bucket 1 and 2, we have a decent number of participants who are still unable to meet the metric when they turn in stuff that's not validated. So that doesn't mean that there aren't other folks who have some surplus, but it's not being contracted between participants for one reason or another, such that when participants are turning stuff in, validated or not, they're able to pass the metric.
So a lot's coming together.
Yeah.
And you're testing it out. But overall, is the capacity metric, would you say, coming down in order to make this program work? Are you able to discern that yet?
Great question. Hard one to answer. So I'd say it's a little apples and oranges comparison. When we model as a group, we can compare year over year. The resource mix changes, which changes, it changes everything. As people, we do this modeling based on people's best estimates of what their resources will be. Oftentimes, even 2 to 5 years out, those resources shift between when they put stuff into the model and then what they actually turn in for forward showing. So I'd say year over year, the metrics are not going down. I'd say, if anything, the trend is mostly flat especially in the corner seasons, some going up because of recent weather events. If we had more flat or lower planning reserve margin in June, and then we had a heat event in June that was back a few years, but finally gets incorporated into the modeling. So things like that are some of the reasons why folks are interested in looking at the metrics again. When you look at what individual participants might have been doing before RAP, that one's the most apples to oranges, right? It's pretty much impossible that they would have been running the exact same expectations and modeling pre-RAP and post-RAP. Most folks would logically have made assumptions about availability of resources from neighbors. And we really, within RAP, we assume no imports. We really assume that everybody's got to kind of stand on their own in the RAP footprint. So there are just differences that make it pretty hard to compare planning reserve margins, which is a real communications challenge for us, for sure.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And thank you also for being new to this relatively new to this discussion, really now a critical component to whether we're going to be able to meet, our reliability standards around resource adequacy and ensuring that, ultimately when this works out, that we'll have this pool that will get us there as well. So really, a new development. I know you guys are putting this together, working really hard to get it done. Really appreciate having you in the mix. Thank you.
Thank you. We are working towards having some metrics that do look forward to the season. We're aggregating participant, activity. The 3 buckets, the bucket of fully validated, and then this bucket of folks turned it in, but it's not fully validated. That kind of puts us in this awkward, we don't know exactly what to make of that. We have some nervousness about releasing information that is just not that clear. And we don't want to mistake stuff that's being turned in that not every box is checked with, resource shortage. And so we've been hesitant to put that out in the world. We have talked with the COSR, the state representative committee, about some of that data. And so we're kind of working towards getting that out in the public sphere for further, metrics, insight, transparency from the program. That's the vision. But we've got a little ways to go, I think, as we head towards binding to make sure that those metrics are not misleading in any way.
So I echo Commissioner Duman's thanks for your being here. So we're looking at, I mean, resource adequacy generally in the industry is considered more the long term.
Yeah.
And then you're looking at bringing that long term more into this medium term season ahead to really verify where we are. And then operationally, and operationally is not really resource adequacy, it's reliability. Are you able to meet your load, right? So just to clarify this, difference between resource adequacy and actual operational liability.
Yeah, the operations program, I mean, RAP is such a unique program insofar as we are quite confident there is no other standalone regional resource adequacy program potentially in the world, at least not in the US. And so the need in order to plan together on that two-year and then all the way into 7 months time horizon, where folks do the showing, we had to have a way in which the assumptions we want to make in that showing and the modeling, we want to assume that everybody shares their diversity. But at present in the bilateral West, there's no way to assume that happens. And so there is a lot of potential for integration with the day-ahead markets to do that even better than we can do it in sort of the clunky operations program. But that really is the purpose of the ops program in RAP, is to say, in order to make those assumptions and the modeling valid, we have to have some mechanism whereby folks can be on the hook to share any surplus during the operating time horizon.
Right.
Yeah,
And
but
the
it's not a traditional resource adequacy timeline. Yeah.
But the whole purpose of this is to create that incentive for the utilities to acquire the capacity and the energy that they need for that season, right?
Yeah, there's, especially when we think about the space we were in 2018, 2019, thinking, okay, what we need is that kind of market signal to value capacity and pay for capacity such that then we get capacity built. We are at a pretty different dynamic now. People will in fact pay for capacity probably without the RAP, because they know they need it and they are looking at these load forecasts. It's more like they can't get enough. So there is a changing paradigm here underneath RAP, but that was, of course, the main objective was to make sure that there was that like macro motivator to value the capacity and not just the energy.
But that incentive enough isn't going to get things built, right? I mean, so we've got other dynamics going on. We've got interconnection queues that are growing because we
100%.
we don't have the transmission capacity. And, we've got issues with permitting. Some of us were just at the Western Conference, and one of my favorite lines was somebody who was saying that permitting is like Bigfoot, right? So that's a critical issue. So we've got other issues that it's not all on RAP, right?
And we can't solve it
and
all,
you
right?
can't solve it.
Simply putting the motivator out there does not mean that folks will be able to conjure up resources. And we are sort of beholden to all of those other things being on a path to be fixed or navigable by utilities in order to, I mean, it's a voluntary compliance program. So if you aren't confident you can solve all of those other problems, then of course you're going to be hesitant to move into a binding version of RAP, because there's so many other factors, exactly as you say.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Rebecca.
So I actually only have one other slide here, which is a bit more of an eye test than I was anticipating. But the real objective here is just to highlight this new world of RAP that we're embarking upon is looking at, we stand up task forces. They're just any stakeholders from anywhere can be involved in these task forces to talk about these topics. So there's a number of ways that you can make changes in RAP. One is, if you have an idea and a solution and all of the red lines to the tariff or business practice, you can put that in and it can go through the approval process on its own timeline. But if you just have kind of I think this is something we should talk about, or I'd like folks to get in a room and think about this problem. So that might be like the earlier forward showing metrics or the volatility that we've seen with some of the monthly planning reserve margins. November has been higher than folks would like it to be. For a while, that was explainable by the fact that the denominator for the planning reserve margin is the load for that month. And so November load is usually lower. And so necessarily the planning reserve margin might be a bit higher. More recently, we've seen, as we incorporate some other recent historical weather patterns, we've had other inputs that have caused that planning reserve margin to go kind of even higher. And so there's just methodology changes that need to be revisited and thought about in order to make sure we aren't having unintended consequences from our intended policies. So that's, an example of kind of a problem that folks want to talk about, that there's not a clear solution, but there's some sort of objectives. I'd like to get these metrics earlier to be more certain about what they'll be. I'd like to make sure there's a little less volatility in those shoulder months, particularly. Similarly, like the day ahead market optimization is looking at the Southwest has its own kind of optimization function within RAP. And as we think about integrating with markets, there's a lot of opportunity for the operations program and for that kind of our very basic optimization function to potentially be improved. And so those things kind of converge in that other task force. So there's a number of these things that will be standing up, these stakeholder-led task forces to kind of think about what those policy proposals will be. And it's just something RAP hasn't gotten to do yet as we've been getting the baseline set. But a lot of hope for the evolution of the program and continuing to kind of live into what the stakeholders need it to be part of the program while we continue to head towards the binding version. So I think that's it. And Katie can now respond to me if there aren't other questions.
Well, if I could, just a couple questions. One, and it strikes me as we think about the planning reserve margin on a monthly basis, and I think the concern you identified is the volatility, maybe even in the shoulder months. I'm kind of putting together a couple conversations we've already had, which is as you see large loads come on, the weather variation of a large load is far less, right? The large load kind of stays within the stack pretty consistently regardless of the weather. At least that I think is generally how we understand large loads to operate, at least the ones that are coming on. So you're kind of shifting the peaks higher because you have this bigger stack at the bottom. But the concern I have in that is the shoulder months are probably times when we're also seeing generators take an outage for maintenance, et cetera. And if that planning reserve margin in that time is volatile, it's going to be harder to schedule that outage. And then I look at that, take the bigger picture. You're probably, my concern would be if everybody takes that outage at the same time, then we have a concern. So how are we thinking about like outage scheduling to make sure that, or how is RAP thinking about it?
So RAP has no program, no metrics presently in October and the back half of September. And then in April, the end of March, April, and May. So we don't have any insights there, generally speaking, at this time. So there is, two sides of that. One is there's a lot of flexibility for folks to do what they need to do. There's also a potential, black box situation about when people are taking outages. That doesn't mean we can't be running, say, the sharing calculation and kind of sharing some of that information, or we have the raise hand function, which is possible people would want to watch that. These are all kind of TBD conversations when we have a more binding program. In RAP world, there are a number of ways folks can deal with outages. It's a bit participant to participant, depending upon how there's a backbone of rules, but then depending upon how they manage those outages, they may interact with the program differently. So one end of the spectrum would be you tell us about all of your outages. That's particularly relevant if you don't have control to move them. So imagine you are a federal entity who relies on another federal entity to run, hydro, for instance. Maybe you have less control than someone else who has a feedback loop for some of the shorter outages, for instance. So if you have the ability to walk down the hall to your generation department and say, hey, I know you were thinking of taking this outage in November, but the weather looks like we might need it online, then you are basically telling us in an attestation, I don't have enough solid information about exactly when this outage is going to happen. And so I'm just telling you I will always take it out of my surplus. So we don't ever tell you which units to run. We don't tell you kind of how to meet your obligation. So the risk is on the utility, but also the flexibility is on the utility to say, take an outage when they don't have an obligation to the program, when it looks like it's going to be a more mild time. So I think there is certainly some coordination that's left on the table there kind of intentionally, but it is intended to kind of allow that flexibility for the folks to deal with, the big swath of possible circumstances surrounding the flexibility they have with outages. The backstop is if you have like a unit on the floor of the dam, then if it's going to be there still at the beginning of the season, you have to tell us that. So if it's something that's a multi-year sort of thing, we think we capture that because there's very little flexibility there. Yeah.
I think for the sake of time, we should probably move on. We can always come back during the Q&A session to more questions. So Rebecca, I need you to stop sharing your screen so that I can steal it from you again. Thank you so much. And let's try to go back to Katie Rogers from WEC here. Let me pull up these screens. Katie, would you like to try to say something again? No luck. Calling in on your phone, please. And is it *6 to unmute? Let me check the slides here.
I believe it is *6.
Thank you. Yeah, in the meantime, if there are questions from the public or from anyone on the bench, this would be a great time.
One more quick one is it seemed like resource accreditation was based on historical performance for the most part. What happens if we do find Bigfoot and there's a new resource that comes online? How does that get accredited? How do they show what their capacity factor basically would be? I'm assuming it's a renewable resource, zero carbon resource.
Yeah, so I think it is dependent a bit upon each resource type with respect to, and it's not exclusively on historical, but there is kind of always an element of performance in whichever methodology is being used dependent upon the resource type. But all that to say, you can typically, again, depending on the resource, be showing, engineering drawings or some kind of, expectation for a resource. In the case of variable energy resource of sorts, we run an effective load carrying capability study, ELCC, and take, we have like averages across a zone. So there's sort of a default available. If you're putting in, there is one task force that's intended to look at whether we don't have any sort of marginal ELCC, if you're familiar, concept right now. So when new resources come in, all of the existing resources may take a hit, right? They all share in that capacity. It is accredited to folks based on their own historical performance or forecasted performance if it's new. So they get some benefit for being, the high performer or well-placed wind, for instance. But that said, there's a kind of a consideration for doing this on more of a temporal basis by vintage. So it's not all the way to a typical marginal ELCC, at least based on the current kind of scope of the task force. But it is kind of looking at, can we be motivating folks to, if you've already got variable energy resources and adding new ones is only marginally helpful, can we be giving the right signals to that kind of build? So
one more question, I guess, or do you have time? Need to move on. Is Katie available? Okay. I can ask offline.
Let's see if we have Katie on the phone. And if not, I think we should jump.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hooray. Go ahead.
Wonderful. I am so very sorry. I don't know what the problem is, but I apologize profusely. Okay. Moving my speaker closer. So hopefully that's good. Okay. Perfect. So I'm going to share a bit about the summer outlook from the WEC perspective. Perfect. Yeah. So one of the big changes that you'll see this year in the SRA, the NERC SRA, is that we changed our regional boundaries. And this is for a couple of reasons. One is you can see the Northwest just dominated the prior map, which made it really hard to dig into some of the differences that were going on in some of the states represented there. And one of the other big changes is that California and Mexico were grouped together, and we made the split to separate those as well. So this map not only is improving things like the summer reliability assessment, but also this will be used in the NERC LTRA. This is used in WEC products such as the WARA or Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy, in addition to the production cost model that we share with stakeholders, which is the ADS or the anchor data set. So we're making this consistent across the WEC product. So hopefully that makes it easier for all using it, in addition to the granularity that it provides. If we go to the next slide. Perfect. So this is just a recap of the NERC SRA. So obviously NERC is looking at the entirety of the United States plus the Canadian provinces and then our little slice of Mexico. And there's, you know, we, as Victoria shared, the ERO, we gather all the data within our respective regions, and then we pass it up to NERC, and then NERC looks for trends and things that are happening across the entirety. And then they translate what they're seeing into these kind of three metrics, either normal risk, elevated risk, or high risk. And I just want to emphasize that normal does not mean there will be no issues for sure, certain, locked in. It means that we're at a normal level for risk, that we have sufficient operating reserves, or we expect to. But of course, things can always go south, and that may not be the case. So just a reminder that normal doesn't mean no chance. It means that when we look at the average or expected demand conditions, that we don't foresee any major concerns. The orange areas, which represent the elevated risks, those tend to be like in extreme situations that risk then gets introduced. So again, it might not mean under normal conditions that there's a risk. We can go to the next slide and dive in a little bit deeper. So you know, in the last map, most of North America, most of it had adequate resources for normal summer demand. And like I said, those areas that were indicated as elevated generally are during stressed conditions that they see a higher level of risk. And obviously generator retirements, as Victoria talked about, you know, while based on capacity numbers, if you look at retirements versus additions, those might be equal, or in fact, we may be looking like we're adding more capacity. We all know that with renewable resources and non-dispatchable ones, that we tend to not get the same level of energy out of those resources. So it's not necessarily a one-for-one swap. And then we've talked about how the peak demand is increasing. But the good news is we are adding a lot of solar and battery storage across the entirety of the footprint, which is really helping to keep those risks lower and those concerns more mitigated. Okay, so we go to the next slide. All right, so the Western Interconnection, kind of touched on this already, but the only subregion that we identified in the Western Interconnection as having anything above a normal risk is that little piece of Baja California and Mexico. And again, that's due to extreme situations could diminish those reserves that are available. Otherwise, from the last SRA or Summer Reliability Assessment from last year, we have improved, which is fantastic. And a lot of that is attributed to the addition of new capacity. Again, over the portfolio in the West, we saw 6.5 gigawatts of new solar capacity plus 7 gigawatts of battery storage. And then British Columbia, who was previously indicated as a higher risk, I think elevated, higher, not high, they added specifically 500 megawatts of hydro capacity, which helped bring them back into that normal risk level. Next slide. So this chart shows how that demand forecast has changed for each of the subregions across the whole footprint. In the West specifically, we had a lot of our subregions are in that higher end of growth. Rocky Mountain is the highest, as you can see, but that's because it started at a lower position. So it could be that they're just catching up with that level of electrification and large loads that they're forecasting. Specifically for the Northwest, there was a 2.4% increase from the prior forecast. So for the Northwest specifically, the peak hour is anticipated in July. And again, as Victoria shared, there's two ways that we measure load. And one is, the entirety for the year, and the other is peak. And so we could see trends where, the peak is moving, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the totality of energy consumed over the year could still be going up, even if maybe the peak drops or moves around a bit. So it's, two different ways for us to look at it. And obviously the peak is when everything is happening and tend to be the most stressed periods. The chart on the right kind of breaks that down. So on that blue bar is that level of anticipated resources that we have. And then the different pieces as you move to the right are where those resources are would be attributed, if you will. So on the far right, that solid orange bar is our expected demand. And then you can see that hash orange box is how that demand would change under an extreme condition. And then the two red speak to the operating reserve requirements and how those would meet up to the anticipated resource level. So, if you could go back real quick, sorry. You've been so good, and I was lagging. So extreme heat is definitely one of the highest risks that we heard, or concerns that we heard in the West, but in the Northwest specifically. And that extreme heat has the benefit of not only increasing those loads, but also reducing transmission ratings. Derates of thermal units can happen, and then depending on the heat, that can create conditions that are ripe for wildfires, which introduce additional risks. And then, of course, in the Northwest specifically, that hydro variability is a wild card that it's hard for us to know exactly what it's going to look like. So we just hope that those extremes don't line up at the same time. Okay, now we can move to the next one.
And Katie, there is a question in the chat from Representative Ybarra.
Yeah.
And Representative, I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask, but Katie, if you can't see the chat, it is in there.
I'm not sure I understand the question, so if you wanted to maybe ask it, that would be helpful for me.
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we're working the Columbia River Treaty some years ago. We're waiting for the outcome and how the Canadian entity and the American entity were going to, who was going to get the power and who wasn't going to get the power. Does that outcome of the Canadian River Treaty signing, I know it hasn't happened yet, but in the near future, the American entity will get less or more energy. Has that been put into your analysis of the WAC?
That's a great question. And I don't know that I know for sure, but I can give you what I think. So we don't have contracts. We don't represent them. We're not given that information. So when we do a resource adequacy look, we're basically just saying, does the energy exist somewhere in the interconnection and can generally flow where it's needed? So if the question is about contractually who gets that energy, it would not be represented in our modeling. And to be fair, that is something that we've talked about, that as new policies come into effect, like around clean energy sources, and the willingness or unwillingness to use those in certain places, that question of contracts may play a bigger role. As of now, we don't represent them. So we've just said the energy is, or we anticipate it to exist, to be available, and it can get where it needs to go, regardless of what kind of contracts may be in place.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, hopefully that helps.
And Katie,
Yes.
this is Commissioner Rendell in
Yeah.
advance of this next slide about the resource projections, and also the last slide. Does WEC factor in demand response as a resource, or virtual power plants as a resource? Or are you just looking at steel in the ground, what we consider traditional resources?
Yeah, I believe we only consider traditional resources when we talk about resource projections. Obviously, we do model demand response, but I don't believe we represent that in these numbers that are talking about resources. So it's in the model, but I don't believe reflected in these specific numbers as we talk about resources.
Okay, because in the prior slide, if the issue right now are certain hours at risk and certain peak periods, that's what demand response and sometimes virtual power plants are designed to address. So just curious about how you plan on addressing this in the future to get a holistic view of what is going on. I know there are questions about relying on demand response and whether they're, whether you can rely on them or not. And so just a request going forward. And I also see there is a request from Representative Mary Dye, and I don't know if you're able to come off mute.
And I'll just jump in. After this question, we'll go ahead and hold all questions until the end of the panel, because we are sort of pushing up against time. We do have 2 more presenters here. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for letting me join. My question is about the heat dome. We noted that there was no wind for an extended period of time, so that resource wasn't available. And I'm wondering if in your planning you were taking into consideration for extreme heat, that the likelihood that there would be a lack of wind energy generation during those periods.
Yeah, I know, especially since we're getting short on time, I'm going to try to keep it short, but I'd be happy to answer any questions offline if that's something you want to talk more about. But we do a probabilistic assessment, and so we look at wind and look at the likelihood of wind events in correlation with the load events. And so when we do extreme events, we line up those probabilities. So we don't necessarily go through and say, oh, at this day, at this time, the wind is going to be, X amount of energy or generation. But we do look at those tail ends of likelihood, which then create those extreme events. So I don't know if that answered your question. And again, if you'd like to talk about it more, you're welcome to reach out to me and we can dig deeper into that. Okay, I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly, and this is just kind of sharing, what those resource projections are. I just want to add a caveat too, that when we collect this data from entities, it's like as of the end of last year. So there was, stuff that's known and that would have happened from last summer, but then there's also what's been anticipated. And even though we're sitting here on June 5th, so we know in our heads that, we can see what happened from January to June. We don't have that represented in our data. So just keep that in mind, that obviously things are always changing. We have to draw a line in the sand. So this data is as of the end of last year. And, depending on how that has actually happened until this point and up until the summer could then impact those results. We can go to the next slide. And this is just breaking down those variable energy resources. It kind of shares what the capacity, the nameplate capacity is, and then how much of that we're expecting for hydro, wind, solar, and then energy storage. And I believe these are posted. So I'll go to the next slide and you can go in. I know this is a lot of information to try to take in quickly, but you can look at it at another time and again, reach out. So this is just a little bit of a look back at 2024. It was one of the fourth hottest, or it was the fourth hottest on record. Luckily for us, what happened in that situation, even though it was the fourth hottest, is that we did have that our peak demand came in lower than anticipated. And at the same time, wind and solar came in higher than what was expected. So luckily, even though it was so hot, there was no disruptions to the bulk power system. So fantastic. We can go to the next one. Here's some heat maps that just kind of share, where we are with an anticipated heat in the summer outlook. Obviously, as indicated by our BAs and by our entities, extreme heat is definitely one of the concerns for this summer. So if it turns out that the opposite of what happened last year happens, where load is higher than we anticipated and wind and solar are lower, that's where those risks can enter. We can go to the next slide. This one then speaks specifically to wildfires. Obviously, wildfires can threaten generating assets or transmission lines, transmission assets. And so not only that, but just the smoke that is created by wildfires can also have an impact. Again, a lot of data. This table shares the amount of acreage that was burned over the last couple of years. And then the maps on the right kind of show what the outlook is for both drought and wildfires. And then I have two more. Okay, and then if the chart is hard to read, so this one might be more appealing to you. Here's a visual representation of that acreage burned by state over the last 3 years. Very unfortunate. And then I think I have one slide left. And then while we wouldn't specifically say this is a risk to resource adequacy, it's important to note that when there is high risk of wildfires or conditions that could lead to wildfires, we do see public safety power shut off. So, while this isn't necessarily a reliability risk, it could mean that power is getting curtailed due to that wanting to limit those risks of wildfire. So those events have been increasing. And I believe the number of entities who can call these shutoffs is increasing as well. So just important to note that in those really high-risk wildfire situations, you may have shutoffs as a preventative measure. And I believe that's my last slide.
Thank you
Sorry
so
for
much.
rushing at the end. Hopefully we saved a little bit of time though.
That's all right. In the interest of time, I'm sure we have plenty of questions, but we'll go ahead and hand it to our folks from the Bonneville Power Administration, who I believe are sharing their own slides today. Thank you so much, folks from WEC.
Yes, this is Steve Belkoff from Bonneville Power. I'm trying to pull the slides up here. Hopefully you can see that now.
Yes, we can.
Can you? Okay. Hello, I'm Steve Belkoff, Bonneville Power. I am Bonneville's lead on the RAP program and part of the long-term planning group. And I'll start the conversation. Rob Hawkins will have the last slide of the deck, and I'll let him introduce himself as we get there. So we heard earlier from Rebecca from Western Power Pool on RAP, and she noted that there's not a lot of information that can be shared because we're still in a non-binding program. So I'm going to feed on that a little bit and add to it and share a little bit of Bonneville's perspective on that as our readiness in RAP. So as was discussed, RAP's still non-binding. Participants will become binding in the winter of 27-28 with that first season. I'll skip a little bit of the first because of what's here on the slide, because Rebecca covered all that already. I wanted to note that forward showing for this summer was actually, for this summer season was actually set last October. So that's when our submittals were done. There's a process in place where we submit that data, and then it goes through a review in the cure period, which occurred all the way through until February of finalizing that data submittal and making sure that we, as a participant, like everybody else, could actually cure and solve any issues with the program, and making sure that we had the resource QCCs from the program to cover both our forward showing P50 load as well as that planning reserve margin that had been talked about. And those are important parts. And then walks into the operations program, which really walks into things that are happening today. So we're in a summer season, even though it's non-binding, we're in a summer season, and we're making data submittals to show what those resources are doing today against what our load is today for both the next week, as well as for tomorrow, and as well as within the operating hour, and then submitting after the fact information associated with that. Well, we still are in a non-binding program. All these things are occurring. Participants, including Bonneville, have stood up systems, put systems in place to be making all these activities happen. So that planning all the way from the forward showing to show that we have acquired those resources and set ourselves up to be in place for the summer season, all the way into the operations of we're doing this work day to day and we're submitting data. That does walk you into a couple of issues with the operations and being in a non-binding program. As Rebecca talked about, that as non-binding, we don't have all the components of an operations program. We can't lean on the program and absolutely be required to support. But we are going through a process as participants of making those data submittals, showing that information, putting it into the systems. And in this interim basis, how we're non-binding, we created a raised hands function. Rebecca noted that really quickly, but there is a raised hands function that we've put in place as participants that participants are monitoring for. And that simply says that if a participant in the program is in trouble, is short, that there's a function to raise your hand and alert the other participants. And through the non-binding program, that's a voluntary reach out to help them solve that issue on 1 hour or more hours. So that is a step in the process to fill a gap between the time we're non-binding and we are and we become a binding program in 27. So those are important parts. I wanted to take you guys a little bit to where Bonneville's position sits today. So as we sit here on June 5th, we are in that summer season. In our forward showing looks, we submitted that data and put information together that put us into a perspective of how we look in each season. And these graphics are just a simple graphical representation of where Bonneville sits as a participant within the program. That you see the blue line in the top graph, see the blue line is our portfolio QCC. Those are the resources we have available to meet our load. The yellow line is our forward showing obligation. So that is our expected P50 load plus a planning reserve margin. And it fits together. The green is that forecasted demand. So the difference between the green and the yellow would be the planning reserve margin, and put that together. So as you can see, Bonneville sits in a position that we have more QCC than our forward showing obligation. So we pass the test to meet our forward showing requirement in RAP and are showing that we have our capacity available. The bottom graphic is a simple representation of the transmission requirement side of that same forward showing requirement, that 75% of that we have to have firm transmission available to meet 75% of the resource to load picture. So that is the transmission required to get from the resources identified in the top graphic to the loads identified in the top graphic, and that we meet that requirement as well. So this is how we stack up in RAP, and then we walk that into the current positions of the operations program. Any questions on Bonneville's planning side of how we got there?
We're actually going to keep moving, Steve. I'm sure we have questions.
Okay.
But, we'll save them for the end. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn this to Rob.
Yes, good morning. My name is Rob.
Rob, we heard you for about 3 seconds there. Still can't hear you if you're trying to talk.
Looks like they're connecting. Maybe you switch to your phone.
In the meantime, can we take one question for Steve, if there are any questions? Oh,
We're having a connection issue, it looks like.
okay, taking temperature here. Would we like to jump to Washington State Climate Office and come back to BPA, or should we? Okay. Okay, I do know that we have Karen from the State Climate Office, and I will go ahead and share your screen. Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, great. Just a minute while I pull up your presentation here.
Can I share mine? I've updated slides 10 and
Oh, that's right.
14 based on the latest info.
Then we will need BPA to stop screen sharing. Hopefully you can hear us, BPA.
Is there a way to disconnect them?
Let's
Oh
see.
yeah, maybe we could do that.
I got it. It says multiple presenters can share now. So let me
Oh,
try.
great.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, control team.
Does that work? Oops.
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, let me start a timer too to make sure I'm keeping us on track. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. My name is Karen Bombacco. I am the Deputy State Climatologist for Washington State, and I'm located at the University of Washington in Seattle. So some of you might have heard in early April, the Washington State Department of Ecology issued an emergency drought declaration for the Yakima watersheds. So on the right-hand side, that's that darker orange color. And then a drought advisory, the kind of lighter tan color for parts of 7 other counties. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the conditions that led up to the drought declaration in early April, and then the outlook for the rest of the summer. So what we're looking at here is our precipitation percent of normal. So the tan and the brown colors indicate below normal precipitation. The green colors are above normal, and then the white is near normal. So this is going back to October of 2024 through May. And what we can see here is that kind of that tan color for parts of Western Washington and in the Cascades is between 70 and 90% of normal precipitation, so below normal, which is not what we wanted to see this winter. And then some normal to above normal precipitation in Eastern Washington, sort of for that water year as a whole. But if you look since January, this precipitation deficit is even more apparent. So as shown here, we see below normal precipitation across all of the states. Kind of this darker brown color is between 50 and 70% of normal along the eastern slopes of the Cascades, and then parts of the Olympic Peninsula. So again, this is since January precipitation. So we've been on the dry side for this winter. We were starting to see a little bit of this on those BPA slides, but this low precipitation has resulted in below normal spring snowpack. So what I'm showing here, this is percent of median snow water equivalent. So that's all of the water if you were to melt the snow down. So what's in our snowpack. The big numbers here are the basin averages, and then each of those individual circles are individual stations where we're monitoring our snow in the mountains. So I'm showing April 1st. This is the typical peak in snowpack for Washington State. And average statewide, we were only at 87% of median on April 1st. And then you can see some of these individual basins averaged between 67 and 82% of median in the northern and central Cascades. So we saw much below normal snowpack in some individual basins, better snow in the Olympics, kind of the southern Cascades, the Blue Mountains in the southeastern Washington, and some parts of the foothills of the Rockies. So this is a way to look at our snowpack and sort of see how that situation has evolved throughout the season. What we're looking at here is our average snow water equivalent for the state as a whole. That's in our black line here. So going back to October and to just a few weeks ago near the end of May. And then it's most useful to really compare this black line to our, that's represented by those percentile bands in the background. The green band here is what we would consider normal for our snowpack. That's between the 30th and 70th percentile. And what you see here is we peaked earlier than usual for and this is averaged for the whole state of Washington. Our peak was earlier than usual. We peaked on March 24th. Usually we peak about April 5th. And then you can see that our snowpack has started to melt quicker than usual and earlier than usual. So we had lower to begin with, and then it's melting faster than usual. The orange line here is what we saw last year. So this is 2024 water year. So not only did we see low snowpack this year, but we saw it last year. So we're dealing with sort of multiple years of drier than normal conditions for both for precipitation and showing up in our snowpack. This is just elaborating on that point in terms of the earlier meltout. These are those individual snow sites around Washington. And then this is showing how many days earlier than usual that snow completely melted out. So while we still have snow on average for the state of Washington, there's several of these sites, these kind of lower elevation sites especially, that have already melted out earlier than usual. So the units on this plot, these are days, and all of those yellow points are really between 2 and 4 weeks earlier than usual. We can see some 30 days over here, 3 weeks, 21 days up in the northern Cascades. And then even the green dots, which show kind of the range of normal, it's still on the earlier side. So 5 days in the Olympics here, we have about a week earlier in some of these other locations that have melted out already. So I spoke about this already. Not only did we see below normal snowpack this year, but it was on the heels of last year where we saw below normal snowpack. So we're starting to see some compounding precipitation deficits. This isn't the first year where we're seeing these conditions. On the left, I'll take a minute to explain this plot. This is just for the upper Yakima Basin, so we're getting, kind of specific for one basin in the state. But the green line is showing our normal precipitation. This is going back to October of 2014. So when those and the gray line is actual. So when those lines are on top of each other, that means, precipitation is falling as we expect. So this blue upside down triangle here is October 2016, and that is where we had a surplus of about 6 inches. If you take a look at this red triangle, which is March of this past year, You can see that gray line starting to separate from our normal green line, really beginning back in 2023. So that is showing a long-term deficit of precipitation for the upper Yakima Basin. On March 12th, there was a 36-inch deficit, which is the maximum deficit in this pretty short data record, but going back to 2014. On the right, this is a drought index called the Standardized Precipitation and Evapotranspiration Index for 3 years. And it shows that parts of Western Washington, including the Cascade Mountains here and some of the east slopes of the Cascades, are in this dry index over this long 3-year period. This drought index takes into account precipitation and temperature, and again, is just more evidence that we're kind of in a dry period right now for parts of the state. So going back to that, a drought emergency declaration that Ecology issued in early April, it was sort of the long-term deficits in Yakima that really drove that early declaration, because it was clear in early April that we weren't going to make up the snow that we weren't seeing. We weren't really going to make a big dent by filling reservoirs with spring precipitation. And so this is very geared towards agriculture, but the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation in just mid-May said that the junior water users in the Yakima region, which of course is a very important region for agriculture in our state, are only expected to receive 48% of their total water allotment. So the senior water users will receive all their water, but the junior water users will have less than half available for irrigation. So this advisory part of the state, that's a communication tool to indicate that drought might develop in those areas. And I will say, since early April, there's several committees that monitor conditions, and the Technical Advisory Committee has recommended to the Department of Ecology that some of these areas have reached the technical definition of drought. And so they're currently going through the process of potentially expanding the declaration, though that it's not official yet. So this I borrowed from my Washington State has a very specific definition of drought. It's written in the state statute. There's a hydrologic threshold where the area is either receiving or projected to receive less than 75% of normal water supply. So water supply can mean snow, stream flow, precipitation, etc. And then there's also this hardship threshold that has to be met. So the water users and the environment are expected to experience undue hardship because of the lack of water supply. So like I was just saying, that hydrologic threshold, the committee that has met has determined that that has been met for other parts of Washington state. And so they're currently going through that process. For some more background, a declaration allows Ecology to do 2 things. That they can expedite emergency water transfer applications, and then it also establishes a grant program to mitigate hardship to water users, and the environment, and government entities can apply to that. Okay, so a little bit of an aside going into those details, but just wanted to give some background here. There's also another product, and this is a slide that I changed because this map just came out this morning. This is called the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is separate from the state's drought declaration. So like I said, the state drought declaration has very specific rules written into statute. This is more of an objective measure of drought. It's groups of scientists looking at drought indicators, and what they look for is the convergence of those indicators to draw this map in percentiles. So what are the is updated on a weekly basis. It's not a forecast. It's just showing what the current conditions are in Washington as of today. And so for most of the state, we've have those abnormally dry conditions. Like I said, we've been dry since January for the most part. And then some of this moderate drought throughout the central part of this Cascades, where snowpack was low, is melting fast, and there's multiple years of concerns there as well. Okay, so shifting into our summer outlook. El Nino Southern Oscillation, you've probably is an oscillation in the equatorial tropical Pacific. It has an oceanic component and an atmospheric component. And why we implications for our weather in Washington State. So it can kind of change weather patterns. This is really critical in the winter season. It's not a real big player in our weather for summertime. So right now, our ENSO status is neutral. We're not in an El Nino or a La Nina. We're not expecting it to really matter for our summer. I did just want to put this up. This is an outlook going into next year. So in the fall and winter, when we do care about it, right now there's about a 50-50 chance whether we'll see a La Nina versus neutral conditions. Usually in a La Nina, we expect to be a little bit cooler in Washington State for our winters with better snowpack by April 1st. So I'm really crossing my fingers that that's what it turns out to be, so we can sort of turn around these kind of multiple years of poor snowpack for Washington. Okay. We already saw a glimpse of this in Katie's presentation. This is a seasonal temperature and precipitation outlook. So this takes into account Nino and La Nina. It takes into account our seasonal forecast models. It also looks at long-term trends. So what this is telling us is we're expecting that there's a higher likelihood that the summer as a whole will be warmer and drier than normal for Washington State. It doesn't really tell us a lot about heat waves. Those are short duration events that can happen even if we have a cool summer overall, right? So this is saying more as a whole, when we look at the seasonal period of summer, we're expecting warmer and drier conditions. This is the other slide I updated because brand new maps came out on June 1st. This is the significant wildland fire potential outlook for each of our months, June through September. And what this is saying is so the conditions will be ripe for wildfires. Well, I guess they are ripe every year for wildfires, but this is saying in June for Eastern Washington, it's more likely than even a normal summer. So a little bit elevated risk. And then as we move through August, we're seeing all of Washington State, September, all of Washington State. I US because we can of course see smoke impacts from fires in other parts of the West as well. So smoke travels across borders, as you all know. So we could see more instances of wildfire smoke this year and wildfires in our actual state. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. I was just going to talk a little bit more about long-term trends in summer warming. The main point is our summers are warming. We see it in our maximum daytime temperatures and our minimum temperatures. And then the main point on this slide is we are seeing a change in our heat waves. This is all a historical look. So the frequency and duration of our heat waves for when we look at just nighttime temperatures has increased in Western Washington and just the frequency in Eastern Washington, but I'm not going to go into detail there. So just our key takeaways to water year has been drier than normal in Western Washington and over the Cascades. Statewide, it has been drier than normal since January 1st. We've had snowpack in the Central and Northern Cascades was below normal for the season, melted too soon in some locations, and continues to melt at a faster rate than usual. Seasonal forecast models indicate higher odds of above normal temperatures, below normal precipitation for the summer, and then that wildland fire potential is higher for parts of Washington beginning in June and all of Washington by August and September. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure we have questions, but we are pushing up against break here. So in the interest of time, let's jump back to Steve and Rob, who I'm told we can hear. Let's do a mic check. Can't hear anything from you, BPA. There we go.
Sorry for our audio problems. I think the very thorough weather overview that was just presented takes care of most of my presentation, so that's great. I can make this pretty quick. Moral of the story is that all that northern red that we see on the screen is where we would really prefer to have the snow for the best generation value, and we don't have that this year. So we're going to have reduced stream flows where we would rather have higher stream flows. And the opposite is true with the lower blue area, where we have a lot of higher than above average snowpack, but a lot less generation that comes from that area. So 78% of normal water supply is what we're looking at right now. And as was mentioned, it's coming off a little bit faster than average. We're about a week ahead last I looked. Our generation or our outage picture for the summer doesn't look in any way unusual. It's pretty normal. So it shouldn't be impactful given the low stream flows that we're going to have. We don't anticipate any generation impacts from that. CGS is nearly done refueling. We should be back up to 100% in the next week or two. And there are no changes to our constraints from last year. So moral of the story, we should be able to respond to a short-term extreme weather event, but anything extended will be challenging, will be very energy limited this year, just like last year. And that's all I have. Hopefully you heard me this time.
We definitely heard you. Was that Steve or Rob?
Oh, this is Rob Hawkins. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Forgot to
BPA
introduce
has
myself the second time.
concluded their presentation, which means suddenly we are ahead of schedule. That's funny. We do have time for about 4 questions, depending on how long the conversation goes, for the whole panel. Would we like to start with the bench here? Yes, please.
I just wanted to say that, and if maybe somebody can respond in chat. Lauren McCloy from NWEC asks, how much do WASCO and BPA rely on NOAA drought monitoring and forecasting data? So if you can just respond in the chat, that would be great. And now I turn this over to Glenn.
Thank you. And I'm going to see if I can get away with 3 questions because I've been saving them up. And it's just to clarify first for RAP. It sounds like all of the participants have met their required showing for the summer 2025 period. Is that correct?
No, that is
Oh.
pretty far from correct.
Ooh, glad I asked.
But it is the clarification would be it's non-binding, so there's some impact to the thoroughness of trying to get all of the paperwork in order, right? So when we put those sort of 3 buckets together or 3 circumstances, there's the fully validated capacity, and there are a handful of participants who have been able to fully validate all of the capacity that they have, and then also pass the metric. That's on the order of, less than half of the participants. There's a much larger bucket of folks who are turning in capacity that is, in excess of what we can fully validate, but probably is real capacity. It's just not meeting all of the RAP standards and expectations. But even if that's the case, we still have many participants who are not able to demonstrate even unvalidated capacity, enough capacity to meet the obligation. So I think that the difference between, say, the WEC study on the whole and the RAP study is, as I think Katie highlighted, and maybe also Victoria, that we are looking at contracted capacity. So it is possible that when, hopefully, likely, that when you look at the WEC results and you think there is generation out there, it's just not contracted to the folks who, by RAP standards, are obligated to go get it. That hopefully it's available to them in real time when they need it. And that's somewhere between the vision that we have, which of course is non-binding. So there's that big caveat, and the sort of regional look that they have is, the case for the summer. So we hope to be able to fill in some of those gaps, but we're still a little ways from that while we're non-binding for RAP.
All right. Well, thank you. And then for BPA, I wanted to see if there are any particular areas of concern for this summer specifically. And I wanted to ask about the ability to maintain power into the Tri-Cities area. And then also if there are any concerns about the capabilities of the transmission system at the operational level this summer.
That's a great question. Last I looked, we didn't have any unusual transmission limitations, so I would not expect any problems on average. Now, if there's any kind of extreme heat event, that can certainly limit line loading. So I could see where I think last year we had some line loading issues. So under extreme conditions, that could still be a problem, but I don't forecast any current issues with an average summer. Again, we are going to be fuel limited this year, so if we do have an extended period of above average temperatures, that can be problematic.
One more question from the bench, if there is one. If not, do we have any questions from the public? Folks who want to come up to the mic, or folks online? Awkward silence for a few more seconds. Well, thank you, panel number one. Look at how magically on time we are. Thank you so much for being here. We will get the slides updated that Karen updated on June 1st. We will make sure the public has access to those. For those who came in a little late, please make sure you do sign in before you leave. There's a sign-in sheet outside the door. And we will resume, let's say at 10:10 with panel number 2, starting with Puget Sound Energy. And let's be on break until 10:10. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you all.
Mic check, mic check.
1, 2.
Just a quick mic check on our end. Can you hear us? This is Phil Haynes from PSE.
Yes, we hear you great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and bring folks to our seats. We'll get started in a sec here. A reminder for those on Zoom, we would love for you to click the 3 dots next to your name and rename yourself with your first and last name and who you are representing. We would love to know where we have folks from today. And just a heads up to folks that we had a speaker change. We're going to have Phil Haynes instead of Ryan Murphy from Puget Sound Energy start us off. But Phil, just a sec here because we don't currently have any commissioners in the room. Let's wait till at least one comes back. Thank you. No problem. We know we're on a tight schedule here. We are on to panel number 2, which is utility specific perspectives on summer readiness. And thank you very much for Puget Sound Energy for kicking us off. We'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you. My name is Phil Haynes. I'm the Director of Energy Supply here at PSE, and with me today to answer the real hard questions, I've got Chris Smith, who runs sort of the short-term trading and procurement organization for on the energy supply side. So thanks to everybody. You know, there's a lot of really good presentations here today, which covered several things we were going to talk through. So this should be relatively quick, and hopefully we can open it up to the next group and questions relatively soon. But if you can go to the first slide, I'll just go ahead and get started. So just from a very high level, you know, you heard from Rebecca earlier. You heard from Rebecca earlier on the RAP program. We're a proud RAP participant and have been for several years now. We joined several years ago and are planning to go binding in the winter 27-28 timeframe. From a capacity perspective and a long-term planning perspective, you know, PSE tries to pride itself on its on having a diverse mix of generation and also a diverse mix of fuel supply for our thermal resources. So we have hydro, we have thermal, we have renewable resources. So we have a pretty, like I said, diverse mix of resources that we use to serve our customers with. From our thermal resource perspective, for reliability, we also plan on a long-term basis to get our fuel supply from multiple regions. And so we get a lot of natural gas out of British Columbia. We can also get it out of Alberta and the Rockies. So we have three sources of supply to support the resource adequacy of those assets. So essentially, that's the backbone of our resource adequacy program is thermal resources. And it's essentially the principles. There's three kind of main principles that we use, sort of like a three-legged stool. It's we ensure before the summer or even winter. So we ensure before the season starts that we have a healthy fleet of resources. So the outages have been planned properly. The resources are ready to go and be available when we need them most. Secondly, we also plan on deliverability. So transmission, we want to ensure that we have the transmission to get all of those resources, transmission and natural gas transportation both, that we have enough to deliver to our load. And then third is the fuel component of those resources. We have, not only do we hold supply in inventory, natural gas supply and inventory in our storage assets at Jackson Prairie and Clay Basin, but we also have backup distillate fuel at a lot of the resources, just in case there's a pipeline disruption or we're unable to get natural gas to those units. So that's essentially what we lean on for our principles. Next slide, please. And so essentially, what are we doing here on a daily basis? Post planning and actual operations. We are like I said, part of the RAP program. So we are, using the interim program and using that operational program, and currently sort of trying to figure out how that fits. And as we transition to more of that program and away from the bilateral market construct, our traders essentially are constantly monitoring the system and having conversations and with our reliability desks and with our meteorologists to consistently understand what's going on in the region from a weather perspective, from a supply demand perspective, and really situational awareness and continuous monitoring is what we're doing on a daily, hourly, and sub-hourly basis. Also, there's a lot of coordination, and this should take coordination and communication. It's really just managing those changes to the plan. And our plans are developed from a long-term basis, but really executed in the day ahead windows where most of the energy is set up for the next day. And we heard Rebecca talk about the pre-schedule window for the operational program of RAP. This just, our current bilateral structure combines there, and we essentially, that's where the rubber really meets the road from sort of a peak day planning perspective. There's a lot of coordination with the plants, with the generating assets, with the reliability coordinator, and then ultimately there's a few other programs that are within the hour to help us if there's an event. And so that would be the reserve sharing program for the Western Power Pool, and then also the Northwest Mutual Assistance on the natural gas side if there's a pipeline disruption. So those entities can be kicked off if there's a regional problem that needs to be fixed. Next slide, please. And so what does it look like? And I guess how has it really changed over the last couple of years is that, the day ahead planning, we still, that's where like I said, most of the rubber meets the road in terms of setting up and ensuring that we have the right asset mix online to meet a peak day. And what's changed is really just the growing uncertainty with the renewables put in the portfolio. We've had to scale back the amount of resources that we essentially dispatch into that market and hold them back into the real-time market. And what that's really doing is it's just planning for uncertainty. And it's just a larger percentage of the portfolio that has to be held back for uncertainty when you have resources that are intermittent and not dispatchable. And essentially, once we get into the real-time windows, they're managing those hour-over-hour differentials in supply demand just to ensure, it's a 24/7 desk that constantly is managing those swings on a minute by minute, hour by hour, and sort of intraday basis, and really just ensuring that as the portfolio shifts, we have enough resources and that we've planned properly in the long and medium terms to actually meet load. So that's what I've got. Feel free to ask questions if anybody has some.
Thank you, Phil. This is Commissioner Rendell. I'll get on screen here. Appreciate that information. So you might have heard the question I asked WEC about whether their information is capturing for the peak hour and the peak day, factoring in resources such as demand response and virtual power plants. And I know Puget has both and is working on getting more. How does your how do you incorporate those resources into this look, or are you just factoring this as WEC is on your more traditional thermal and steel in the ground resources?
With the newer resources that are demand response, they can be a little tricky because they're retail level and load level programs, but we're in the middle of figuring that question out. And so as an organization, it's one of the challenges that we're currently undertaking is how do you coordinate between the retail and wholesale levels in these programs that basically cross over each other. But early days of the RAP program, we started attacking how we would count a capacity credit for a demand response resource, and that's still undertaking. It's there's really a couple ways we could do it. We can reduce it. It can be load reduction, or it could be treated as an asset. And I think it really just depends on what control the utility has over that over the load and how responsive it can be overall. And so those are things we're working through with our customer groups, is to figure out how to better align those programs with the wholesale procurement side. So I don't think we have a firm answer on exactly how we are going to implement it, but we're in the middle of figuring that out. So it's a really good question.
But really, at this point, when you're in those peak periods, demand is a very important function. And I know Puget has called on demand in the past. So that's why I was asking, is demand, until we can build more resources and more capacity, that's kind of what we have to rely on to avoid having serious problems.
Yes, absolutely. And during the events that some of the peaking events that we've had, whether it was the MLK Day weekend or some of the heat events, the programs have worked. And we have gotten they are a resource. It's figuring out how they qualify, what they can do once we really build that historical data set of what it's capable of, just because they're such a new resource. But yeah, we're in the middle of figuring out that integration and how that really works.
Okay, thanks. Phil, thank you. Just, I guess quickly, maybe you spoke to this, sort of quickly because we don't have much time in the slide, but holding back renewable resources to meet your clean energy transition requirements. We know that we raise rates here based on what you have to purchase, but sometimes folks don't realize that you're also perhaps losing sales, losing revenue as well. And I mean, that's what you're essentially telling us, I think, in terms of holding back until the real-time market. Maybe could you just elaborate on that a little bit? And I'm not asking you to give numbers necessarily, but that's part of the equation here in your, that I guess I just want a little more elucidation on, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've had wind in our portfolio for quite a while now, but as we get more and more, and the region gets more and more, the revenues associated to those resources are the one, they're hard to forecast, but two, they're also hard to recover. And so when you have a lot of, essentially when you have a lot of wind, the price is high. When you don't have any of the price, or sorry, when you have a lot of wind, the price is low. And when you don't have enough wind, or it's under forecast, the price is higher. And so the correlation between wind and price is pretty strong. And so yes, and we have to hold back generation in addition to that to ensure that if the wind doesn't show up as planned, we have something to turn on in its place. And so, from a if we just look at, I guess, the value of a wind resource, we just have to ensure that we're capable of forecasting that properly, because it's not necessarily a one-for-one with sort of the forward-looking price curve. There's definitely a discount associated to the value of the wind generation when it shows up. So hopefully that answered your question.
Quick follow-up to that, Phil. This is Jerry Barrick. Does the entrance into a day-ahead market impact that decision? Is a day ahead enough to impact that decision or that operation? Or basically, I'm getting at, does that change the equation such that if you're bidding that into a day ahead market, then the market operator will make that decision rather than an individual utility decision?
Yes, that's correct. And being able to, I think what the day ahead market does is allow you to hold back less. So the uncertainty value is less. And so that's one of the value propositions of being in an organized market is the amount of wind or the amount of resources you hold back is more covered by a larger footprint. So everybody shares in it, and it's you get a diversity benefit out of that.
Thank you so much. Please stick around and let's hand it off to Avista.
Hello. Yes, I'm going to jump in and share my screen. Hopefully you can hear me. There's a little bit of static on my side, so I got a phone ready if the sound is not good quality.
It's all right for now. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm Elizabeth Fredrickson. I'm the Director of System Operations at Avista. So I have just a few slides to cover our resource adequacy and our operations preparedness for the summer. There are a couple other people online that can jump in and answer questions that are more on the energy supply side if needed. Just a quick overview of Avista. We serve electric and natural gas customers in Washington and Idaho.
Elizabeth, sorry for interrupting. We can't actually see slides yet.
Oh, it's showing that they are sharing. Just a second. How about now?
Yes, there you go. Thank you.
We serve electric and natural gas customers in Washington and Idaho, and then natural gas also in Oregon. And then our generation is in Washington, Idaho, and just across the border into Montana. You can see on the slides here some stats on our pipe and miles of transmission and distribution lines. For resource adequacy going into summer, we have no concerns on serving our peak loads that are expected. Now you can see the load that we have forecasted with the planning margin, as well as our mix of resources on the graph on the right, most of it made up of hydro and gas. And then something we've also focused on over the last year is broadening our transmission portfolio. So we've added several hundred megawatts of long-term firm transmission and also increased our access to transmission through BPA, which opens it up to even more sources than that. So if we have any short-term needs for peak loads, we will address it through the market. For operational considerations, we had a heat dome in 2021, and so we've focused a lot on how to make sure we're set up for any heat events. One thing that we've done is develop an extreme event playbook, so that hits on all kinds of extreme events, not just heat, but it does take into account what situational awareness we'll have. We're constantly looking at the forecast, looking at 7 days out and putting together meetings and check-ins as we see necessary for those situations. It also has actions to take when we're in those situations, whether that's switching capabilities, addressing load concerns, and actions to take to communicate to our customers if we see their outages as a result. SCADA variable limits came into play a lot in our 2021 heat dome event. And so we went through and made sure all of our limits are accurate and our alarms are set up appropriately to get the most out of our equipment in the field, depending on what the temperature is. And then feeder and load balancing has been a focus as well. So do we have our loads shared across our feeders as well as possible to make it effective and efficient, as well as in each feeder, what the phase balancing is. And our engineers across our system have done a lot of work on that over the last couple of years. And with all of that, our largest risk for the summer is definitely wildfires. So I just have a little bit of information on that. I know there's a deeper dive into wildfire later on, but you know, for us, situational awareness is really where we put most of our efforts. We have a wildfire dashboard that was built in-house. You can see a little screenshot of it on the right there. It indicates the fire risk index for each feeder. And when it gets to certain levels, we take certain actions. So we, in 2024, installed 10 cameras, and we're adding another 5 this year, which should be done here in the next month or so. And those cameras are actually a partnership with Washington DNR to share video feeds so they can see our cameras and we can actually see theirs. The cameras will detect smoke and actually send alerts to Avista staff as well as fire responders so they can take quick action. We are also adding weather stations throughout our service territory. We're going to deploy about 100 in the next year, and that's really so we can get the most accurate information in each specific area to help our decision-making process. And then once we're in a situation for the high fire risk, the tools that we utilize are enhanced protection settings, as well as non-ring closing, public safety power shutoff, and we have expedited response agreements with fire dispatch. So for example, if we have a trip and a reclose on a line, we can actually request fire responders to go to that area just to verify that there's no issues. And then for this year, we're actually introducing all of those tools to our transmission lines. We're focused on 115 kV lines this year, but that will have impact on our capacity if we have to take any outages during the summer. And those are my slides.
Thanks, Liz. One quick comment, probably less than a question, but you note there, I appreciate the partnerships that are going on between you and the DNR with the cameras, you and fire responders. I think that's a critical piece to solving the mitigation and response issues. One piece you did note that you're putting in multiple weather stations and sort of connecting up some comments we saw in the chat earlier. As we see the potential for some weather data from the federal level going away, given cuts at the federal level, I think that was the fear that was sort of underlying those questions. Is Avista ready, prepared to engage in partnerships there as well, with whether it be with the State Climate Office or others, to share whatever data comes from those weather stations?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will have to follow up on that. But it makes sense that, you know, as we all are working in the same direction, that we share as much data as possible.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
So Liz, this is Commissioner Rendell, and thank you for this presentation. Question, you mentioned the heat dome from 2021. I remember that vividly. I also remember there were some issues with some transformers on your distribution grid as a result of the heat. Is that part of your extreme event playbook, and how has Avista addressed the impact of heat on its system in terms of how it behaves? And is there a change since 2021?
Yeah, thanks. We do have additional substations and upgraded transformers since 2021. And we've also just identified areas that are loaded up to 90% if our transformers hit that at all. We have specific action plans on switching and other capabilities so that we're ready in case that happens. So the extreme playbook does address those alarms and when we would take action, as well as over the last 4 years, adding to our system to have additional capacity.
Thank you so much, Liz. Please stick around and we will hand it over to Pacificor. Oh, quick question from Commissioner Dumas. Go ahead.
So thanks, Liz. Yes, so you're in good shape on resource stack for the summer, good shape on transmission. Well done securing more firm transmission. You isolated sort of wildfires as quote unquote your definite, highest risk. Is that just because that's essentially the last risk now, or is there something we heard, the climatologist and others, there are some definite risks, overall, but is that always going to be your risk is one the question, or is that just because this summer is particularly difficult?
That's a good question. I think it's probably always going to be up there in the top. I think as loads grow, maybe transmission capacity and generation resources become up there with it. So it was more just about this summer specifically that the wildfire is probably our largest concern. And as we continue, I think our wildfire preparedness path it started in like 2018, I believe. So we continue to get more modern and more prepared for how to react and how to avoid and all that around wildfires. So hopefully the risk diminishes over time, but it will always be there. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thanks. Thank you.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, hi. Sorry, and I'm trying to share. Oh, you had to share your whole screen. Okay. Sorry, 1 second.
While that's going on, there's still a few folks in Zoom who haven't entered their affiliation in their name. We would appreciate if you could press the 3 dots next to your name on Zoom and share who you're representing, whether you're a member of the public or an organization or a customer of a certain utility. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now my screens match. So thanks for your patience. Thank you for having me this morning. My name is Mike Wilding. I am the Vice President of Energy Supply Management at Pacificorp. I'll start off with just a brief overview of outlook for wildfire season. As we heard today, Washington has above average dry conditions, especially in our service territory, which and specifically talking about the Yakima area. And because of that, we're expected to have above average fire season with likely an early start. We're already seeing higher than normal temperatures in June. That's expected to continue through July and August. And here on this graphic on the map, you'll see our service territory is the blue areas in Yakima and Walla Walla, and then that red area, especially up in Yakima, kind of northwest there. That's what our modeling has identified as a fire high consequence area, FHCA, that's shown in red there. So we're continuing to monitor that, but that is a risk that we are monitoring this summer as we're moving into the heat. We continue to, like I said, to mitigate that risk. We have invested or plan to invest nearly $2 billion between now and 2027 to address that wildfire risk. That really takes on 3 core components: situational awareness, system hardening, and operational practices. One of the things that we have new this year for situational awareness is we have a new wildfire intelligence center. This consists of about 15 people that man that center with wildfire science backgrounds and experience. And that's a 24/7 hazard monitoring center. We also have enhanced some of our communication protocols and communication exchange between us and our customers, especially during a PSPS event that will allow for an exchange of information. Also have provided some of the text alerts and that are currently available to our residential customers also are now available to our commercial and industrial customers as well, that they can sign up for that proactive communication. Moving on from wildfire to just kind of general summer. Sorry, Commissioner, did you? Yeah.
I just want to clarify that the 2 billion is system-wide, not just Washington, right?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that is true. You know, Pacific Corp does cover a 6-state service territory on the West Coast: Washington, Oregon, very northern part of California, Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah in the Intermountain West. So that $2 billion is across our system. For this summer, you know, we have had significant resource additions leading into 2024. We've added about 1,000 megawatts of new wind, 320 megawatts of new solar, and 75 megawatts natural gas expansion. What that is a turbine upgrade of our Lakeside 1 facility. It's currently planned to come online here shortly, where during a kind of scheduled maintenance overhaul, we're able to add capacity to that through new technology upgrades that are now available to us. We've also added a new transmission line, what we refer to as Gateway South, that goes from, you can see that here in the map, going from southeast Wyoming, where a lot of our wind fleet is located, down into Salt Lake City or the Mona market hub there in the southwest. That has really done, that was energized at the end of last year, and that wind also came online end of last year, beginning of this year. We still have more wind that will come online over the next 6 to 9 months. And what we've really seen is that transmission line has opened up that constraint that we previously had in Wyoming. So we've seen the increase of wind generation, not only from the new wind, but from the existing wind that was already behind that transmission constraint in Wyoming. And that allows us, even though that Gateway South line goes down into Utah, allows us to move generation across our system by freeing up other transmission paths, including bringing it here to Washington and our customers on the west side of our system. There's no real significant changes in our load forecast from 2024. However, our forecasted peak, coincident peak across the system is 11,163 megawatts. About 800 of that is Washington, a summer peaking system as far as coincident peak is concerned. But even here in Washington, we're starting to see a convergence between our winter peaks and our summer peaks, where we're really a dual peaking Washington utility. Some of the threats that we see, you know, we agree with pretty much everything that's been said, and we have the same forecast available to us. It's going to be a hot summer, above average, above normal temperatures, dry conditions. Really, where we see issues is when there's coincident heat across the Pacific Northwest and the desert Southwest, and then also in California. That's what really begins to stress the system out. Also, earlier when we talked about rising temperatures overnight, you know, we can handle multiple hot days in a row, especially if it cools off overnight. And last summer we saw temperatures drop overnight. When we start to get multiple hot days where it doesn't cool off at night and temperatures stay elevated, that really stresses out the system and causes for extremely high loads. Also, just continuing on the wildfire risk, you know, wildfires under key transmission corridors. We've had over the last couple of years, transmission outages due to wildfire on the California-Oregon intertie, the COI. Also, our main transmission path that goes from the east side of our system to the west side of our system. Last year, we also had multiple wildfires under that transmission corridor. So that's something that we we obviously will be aware of and monitoring. Some mitigating factors, in the past, we have had some fuel supply issues. Those seem to have stabilized, especially with our coal fleet. For us on the Lewis River and Southern Oregon, the Rogue River, we have kind of near normal water years. I'll say a little bit above normal in Southern Oregon and a little bit below normal on the Lewis River. We're hoping that some of the snowpack would run off, but it's getting late in the year, and we think most of that will evaporate and cause for below normal conditions on the Lewis River. And then, we do everything we can, kind of a lot of the same stuff that you've heard from the other utilities, coordinating our generation maintenance centrally, and then also proactively hedging for anticipated stress periods. And then as far as demand response, we do optimize our demand response. We're really excited. We've had 2 really successful demand response programs in Utah for the last little bit. One is our Cool Keeper program, and that's we use for frequency response, which frees up generation on other resources. But that's a device that we put on customers' air conditioners, and we pay them to do that. They can't override that, and then it cycles through the air conditioner load in 15-minute intervals to reduce that load, and then the customer typically doesn't even notice it because, as we all know, our air conditioners cycle on and off anyways. But they can't override it, so it's a very useful tool, and we pay our customers for that. And then the other one is the Watt Smart Battery program, where we have a program where customers can install a battery in their home. They kind of have that first dibs on that battery, if you will, in case of an outage, but we have control of it. So during stress conditions, we can dispatch that battery and we create a virtual power plant. We've also in Utah partnered with developers of apartment complexes, and that creates banks of batteries. So for the first time, I think we just received approval on the west side of our system for both those programs. So there will be a ramp in, won't be a lot for us in 2025, but we're excited for those programs to come onto the west side of our system. That's all I got, but thank you for having me.
We're a bit behind schedule, but that's okay. We can always eat up into later content. So go ahead.
All right, one quick question. Gateway South transmission line, approximately how long from planning to energization?
Oh boy, 17, 20 years. That was in development before I started a company.
And along those same lines, so there's seems to be on that slide multiple options for transmission on your eastern side of the system, but not much connecting to the west. Is there any planning going on to increasing that connection to the west from those eastern resources?
Yes, I mean, we still have the Gateway West project that's under development. B2H is not on this map, or Boardman to Hemingway, which is also still under development. And then there's some smaller transmission lines once we're in the west that we will definitely are in the plan for load service and load growth that are not on this.
Because that would get primarily to Oregon, but then you still have to get, if you have capacity constrained getting into your Washington service territory, recognizing you only have about 135,000 customers in Washington, recognize that, but still, is that a constraint that you're looking at?
It is part of the transmission planning. I'm not aware of any constraints right now. That's kind of the other side of the business, but
Got it.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go briefly to Lauren McCloy from Northwest Energy Coalition.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just following on Commissioner Rendall's question. I was curious why Boardman to Hemingway sort of fell out of PacifiCorp's long-term transmission planning and the effects on resource adequacy that you guys are seeing or anticipating as a result of that project, presumably not being included in your plans. If you could speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I can I can speak to it just briefly. One of the other things that we also took out of our IRP plan was some of the large load customers that we have service requests for. Our key principle in potentially serving those customers is that the cost of serving those customers are not borne by our existing retail customers and our residential customers. And so we took that load out of our IRP and our planning process, which also caused B2H to come out of the IRP. There are sensitivities, I believe. Again, I'm not, the IRP is not under my purview, but we can definitely have more conversations about that, and I can get you in touch with the right folks. But that's generally speaking, that's why you did not see B2H in the plan. It doesn't mean that we've abandoned that. But when we took those large load customers out, and we are still also trying to, find ways to serve them without impacting our existing customers.
Thank you so much. Please stick around and we will move on to public generating pool. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually do not have slides, so we can all stare at the beautiful sunflower picture, I guess. My name is Mary Winke. I'm the executive director of the public generating pool. For anyone not familiar with the public generating pool, we are a trade association of 9 consumer-owned utilities. 8 of those are in Washington and 1 is in Oregon. The unifying factor across the PGP utilities is the operation of non-federal assets. So the PGP utilities collectively have 8,000 megawatts of non-federal assets, and then they are also purchasers of about 45% of the requirements power sold by Bonneville. So both operators of their own assets as well as large customers of Bonneville make up the PGP utilities. So taken collectively, PGP members added all together is about the size of Puget Sound Energy. So I am going to talk a little bit differently than some of my IOU colleagues and try to tie some of this conversation together a little bit today. I really agree with everything that Bonneville and the IOUs are observing in terms of how we're coming into this summer and thinking about readiness for 2025. The PGP utilities are similarly seeing near average hydro for this year, and we don't have anything particular to flag in terms of preparing for summer 2025. So what I do want to kind of focus in on a little bit is more about how we think about summer readiness moving into the future. I think WEC and the other speakers here today really kind of set the stage for what we're facing moving forward. The Northwest, in particular the West Side, has historically been a winter peaking region, but we are seeing that shift and evolve. And as Mike said, moving to kind of a more dual peaking structure. And so there's different ways that we need to think about how we prepare for both seasons and the elements that we really need to think about going into readiness. So, the evolution is occurring, right? We're moving through the energy transition, and that's going to mean that we're going to have different mindsets about how we think about preparedness and resource adequacy in general. So I want to flag just a couple of things. Partly were in my prepared remarks, but also heard today already. The first one, I think BPA mentioned longer events. Are we going to experience more, and Mike highlighted coincident heat events across the West? How do we think preparing for longer events or the events where we do have higher temperatures over the evening? That seems to be kind of the risk scenarios. How can we understand better the likelihood of those scenarios and the region's readiness for those kinds of scenarios? Related to that, thinking through the reliance on imports. I think Rebecca mentioned this. There is a market out there, but it is relatively opaque in terms of what is going to be available in real time during a crisis. And I think RAP is making great strides on having a better handle on what is firm capacity, what is available out there, how will the region do, how will the state do on its own. But at the same time, each state, each region is not an island. We do want to have greater dependency on a broader regional footprint. How can we better understand what that reliance can look like, and how much can we count on imports from other regions and during what circumstances? The third element I want to talk about is transmission. This is something that has been interesting for me personally coming into this year, and PGP as an organization has been working on resource adequacy for many years. Prior to my time at PGP, very focused on resource adequacy. Transmission wasn't really something that we necessarily thought about. Most PGP members are highly interconnected with Bonneville, relying on Bonneville. Historically, it was relatively simple to request greater capacity, greater transmission access on Bonneville's system and have it granted. And so it wasn't something that we thought about as much. Now it is very much becoming a greater resource adequacy issue. So how do we think about the transmission availability in the context of resource adequacy, I think is really important in terms of preparedness, and why Mike had that slide in his deck around, what are the transmission capacity additions that PacifiCorp is adding to its system. So in light of kind of highlighting these areas to think about going into the future in terms of talking about readiness, the other piece that I really want to emphasize here is that, the Pacific Northwest and the West in general is really good at communicating and coordinating with each other across events, across, in readiness conversations, and there's a lot of coordination going on. But the reality is that there's not really kind of a single platform where you can really, okay, I'm going to click on this dashboard and kind of understand where are we as a region in terms of preparedness. And I do think that that is something that you do find in other regions that do have a single organization overseeing all of these different functions. And I am in no way here advocating for the development of such an organization. But my observation here is that because of that, we really need to be able to try to integrate and coordinate on the value of such a dashboard without necessarily having to go, develop an RTO or have that kind of structure. So I do think that's really something to think about going forward. As I said, no state is an island. We are going to need to have better tools, better coordination in the future across states to better understand kind of the readiness picture. I do think the day-ahead market evolution will help with a lot of that. I think we will see more information. Phil mentioned, having better resource utilization. I think that is definitely one of the benefits we'll see with organized markets, but we'll have to have organized markets that are interoperable with the RAP program, that are also interoperable with potentially different RC footprints. So I think it's something to kind of keep in mind just in terms of trying to connect all those dots and making sure that we can, as much as possible, develop that kind of a dashboard, even though we have this very unique West structure rooted in autonomy of different entities and incrementalism, which I think is inherent kind of in the culture to the West, but it just means that we need to think about some of these readiness questions in a little different way than some of the other regions. FERC is hosting a resource adequacy workshop yesterday and today, and they're just focusing on the non-RTO regions. And I haven't found the companion adequacy workshop for non-RTO regions, and I think it's so it just tells you it is kind of a different framework for these regions, and thinking through those components can be a little bit more challenging in some regards. But also, I think there's also a lot of opportunity there to really create tools and programs that really work for us and that people can participate in and can provide value. So I will stop there. Happy to answer any questions and hand it back over to you.
Well, just one, it's not even a question, Mary, but really a comment, which is there is a state that's an island, and it's Hawaii. And having spent
the
some
only one.
time with the chair of the Hawaii Commission this week at Western, and just hearing the challenges that they have, I actually prefer the situation we're in for the very reasons you just said, which is the ability to work together and the coordination that can happen and the resources that are available in that broader perspective, I think do lend itself to being able to solve those challenges more efficiently and more effectively for all customers across the whole region. So appreciate the perspectives there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. And, you're right. There's no RTO, in the immediate future here to have that. But, you heard the question too, Rebecca, about what RAP can potentially be, not just in terms of actually, resource sharing, but that sort of, dashboard, do you see that potential for us out here? Or is that just wishful thinking on my part?
So I'm not going to speak to whether RAP can become that because Rebecca's right behind me and she'd probably, yeah, I don't know what kind of looks she would give me. But I do think there's absolutely, we should have the conversation about how and whether that can happen, whether it's RAP, whether it's, I don't know. I don't have a concept per se on sort of where that lives or how it develops, but I do think it's worth kind of having a conversation about it and how that might work and how we can accomplish it. I don't think we should not try.
Yes, I think we need to try because given all the risks that are, upon us, and maybe not this summer, but, as you point out, and without something like that, that's a huge risk, in itself, it seems to me. So I look forward to all of us having that conversation as we go forward.
Okay. I guess the last speaker gets the bulk of the questions. But Mary, thank you for that overview of the summer readiness for the PGP members. That combined with the report from Bonneville, I found to be very helpful in understanding the consumer-owned utility side of the situation with respect to Washington in this summer. And but I'm interested in some of the things we've heard from investor-owned utilities about the use of demand response programs. And I wondered if you could speak to the efforts that PGP members are putting into, like, as air conditioning loads increase, that those go in day one as being smart loads, the potential use of water heaters as a demand response, and then also getting, kind of capitalizing on the interest in battery systems to use those as a resource for the electric grid itself.
So I do know that several PGP members are doing pilot programs along those lines, but I really don't have a lot of detail. So I would have to defer your question, I think, and happy to kind of get more information on that and greater detail, but don't have a full answer to that question.
Okay, thanks. Well, it is an area of a lot of interest, and maybe we could think
Absolutely.
about it as a topic for the September meeting. But maybe we can work on it in between then too. So thank you.
And I think, I mean, if you'll allow me to that does trigger a little bit a different comment. And one of the key pieces that we need to consider, this is more on the long-term conversation, I think, but thinking about what kinds of technologies are available in the short term, in the long term, are commercially ready to be deployed. And I absolutely agree that the kind of demand response, virtual power plant, those technologies are critical to consider, and what can they accomplish, and is that enough? To your point, Commissioner Rendall, is if those are the only commercially available options, can they deliver what is needed? I think that's really a key question that we need to consider, particularly in the longer term view.
Thank you.
Let's open it up to the room and the Zoom and the phone. Any questions from the public? If there are none, oh, would you like to come up, use the mic here?
I guess good late morning. Nicholas Garcia with WPUTA, the Washington Public Utility District Association. And I was going to respond to one thing about demand response. I am also on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's Demand Response Advisory Committee. And one of the points that's been talked about a lot within that committee is utilities who are full requirements customers of BPA, because those utilities get a very poor, if at all, price signal about demand and the need for demand response and when that demand response should be called. And that's the nature of the contract that the utilities have with BPA. And so while the council thinks that there is a significant opportunity, the market structures right now don't really lend themselves to actually exercising that opportunity unless and until there's a price signal that the utilities will see. And so that it's just a piece of information. It's one of those things that might hinder at least some utilities from pursuing a significant amount of demand response at this point.
So Nicholas, thank you for that. And but there are ways of doing demand response that aren't price responsive. I mean, we're hearing from Pacificora, and I know Puget and others are doing this. It's using virtual power plants and which are connected into the water heaters or the air conditioning load. Obviously, you're for full requirements customers, you are not the BA, so you're not operating these systems. But is there some other way for Bonneville to be looking at their own system? Maybe this is a question for Bonneville, not for you, but if we're looking at non-price responsive, but more system responsive, if they know they're getting to a peak and they're running into a reliability issue in the peak, can they trigger some control systems on the full requirements customers, similar to the WattSmart or other systems, and send you all the message so you can do that? That's just the question, because it's not just about price. It's also about how the system is operating. And are you looking at that in this forum?
So you are absolutely right. And I cannot in any way speak for Bonneville. However, I will say that the need for demand response is pretty clear, I think, in the committee that I've been talking about. And the challenge is that because utilities aren't BAs, because many full requirements, well, all full requirements customers aren't BAs, they don't see immediately the time when there's a fluctuation in load where a demand response would be really helpful. And until there is a mechanism, and it doesn't have to be a price mechanism, it could be some other mechanism, but until there's a mechanism to actually trigger a water heater or a EV charger to shut down or start up, there is I see that there's going to be a significant challenge to moving forward with demand response at this point. And that was the main purpose of me coming up here is just to say that while there's potential, there is some challenges to implementing it at this point that the IOUs probably do not have.
I understand. I was just, obviously this is something maybe to delve into with Bonneville in terms of how it manages its tight loads.
I would like to see if anyone from Bonneville, no pressure, is still around and would like to respond to either that or the question in the chat from Brian from Flex Energy, a VPP provider, who says, should VPPs contract with individual utilities or become an asset in a balancing authority available to all utilities in the BA? Is there an appetite from Bonneville to this? If folks from Bonneville have a response, or if anyone else has a response, that would be fine too. And if not, that's okay.
Steve from BPA is still on. The DR issue is a very active issue that Bonneville is having a lot of conversations on internally, trying to figure out what it would even look like. There is a lot of complications to that. The second issue, I don't know how to address.
And that is totally fine because we are about on time for break. It is 11:09. Let's be back at 11:20, and our next item will be public comment. Thank you very much to panel number 2. Much appreciated.
How's training going for you two? I'm graduating a lot. And you too. Well, training is getting hospital way works. Sure. Hospital work last. No. That's great. I explained that what he was experiencing is not okay. He needs support. So hopefully results. No. Yeah, I believe that's. There's one another code. Some of the key points in line. Sexual harassment can occur between anyone in the workplace, regardless of their relationship or gender. It can also occur outside the office environment or through technology. Sexual harassment involves many forms of offensive behavior, including visual, verbal, or physical conduct of sexual nature, and unwanted sexual advances. There are two primary types of sexual harassment. Quid pro quo harassment can occur when a supervisor offers in exchange for sexual favors, or threatens or takes negative employment action if the employee does not comply. Hostile work environment occurs when unwelcome comments or conduct unreasonably interferes with work performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Yeah, if you want to do it later.
Let's go ahead and come back into our meeting. Our next section here is public comment, and we'll take about 25 minutes for this or less, depending on what happens. A reminder for those on Zoom, I went over this at the beginning, but just in case you're new, we're asking that you use the chat for technical issues, and if you have any questions, closed captioning at the bottom. And to raise your hand, there should be a raise hand feature if you click on reactions. So that's how you can raise your hand to sort of get in the queue to join in public comment, which we'd invite you to do now. And if there's anyone on the phone who'd like to offer public comment, you can dial *9 to raise and lower your hand and *6 to mute and unmute. And we would like to know who you are. So anyone who's sharing, we ask that you please share your first and last name and whether you're representing someone when you speak. And with that, I would like to hand it to Peyton, Energy Policy Advisor, to call on whoever we've got for public comment. Oh, yes. And if there are folks in the room, we would love folks to come forward and use one of the mics to make public comment. Great.
Okay. Christina Wyatt with Big Bend Electric. I just thought I'd follow up with Nicholas's question in response on the demand response. As a Bonneville customer who is in 2 different BAs, technically 3, Big Bend, we don't have any demand response programs because there's no real-time operational signals in order to initiate anything like that. So we haven't reached out to our customers for that reason. In our area, there's also a lot of communication, lack of control SCADA. So that would be a big requirement, and that's very expensive. And there's no fiber in a lot of our area. So there's a lot of layered challenges. And then we are approximately 50% irrigation. As I was explaining to some of my colleagues back there, electricity means water in our part of the area, and the water means whether or not you have a successful crop or not. So Big Bend's stance over history has been to keep the power on to all those irrigators in whatever way possible. And so having a program in place that would ask them to shut off water and then affect the food quality has been something we don't want to touch politically, because we view the food security as a bigger public good than to shave off a few kilowatts, especially since we're at the end of 3 different transmission systems. Anything we would do there would not really help the greater region. So
Christina, thank you for being here. Just a question. So where exactly is Big Bend located? And are you in Washington?
yes, we are in Washington.
Okay.
We are, sorry, I should have started with that.
That's okay.
I know a few people over there at Commerce know exactly where we are, but
Yeah, so we don't regulate public. So yes, we don't have
Yes.
visibility on that.
we are at the south end of a Vista system out of Spokane. So we are from Ritzville, Washington, which is where I-90 meets 395, and we go south to Pasco. So we're connected to Avista's BA in our north end of our region in Adams County. And then Bonneville serves us in Franklin County. And then we have a substation that's tied off of Grant PUD. And so it's a very arid area and the water is critical. So
Thank you. That's really helpful.
you're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for that. I know, and I don't want to put Representative Mary Dye on the spot, but she's an expert on
Yes.
measuring sort of the water necessary for crops. So I'm just wondering, is there anything, have you looked at this into the future? I mean, or is it just, look, you want the water, or you know, you get the water because there is potentially, right, demand response, even for agriculture out there. I mean, easy for me to say, not being an expert, but I know.
Well, and I will say that our farmers have that dialed in. A lot of our farmers are very active in our conservation measures, which I will say that if anybody has extra, we usually spend it on our irrigators because they line up and they do VFD projects. They do a lot of the water drip. And so we're very active on conservation. But the circles take a set amount of time to go around their square mile radius. And the farmers really are the ones that measure that moisture level and everything. So it's on their side.
Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. All right, it looks like we have a question or comment online from Lauren McCloy.
Great. Hi, everyone. Lauren McCloy here today on behalf of the Northwest Energy Coalition. I just want to start by expressing appreciation to the Commission and Commerce, and especially the staff and presenters who put all this information together. I think it was really well presented. It's a lot of information, but it's really important to get this kind of big picture overview out there in the public realm on a regular basis. I think it's super educational, and I think over time, you know, building the knowledge in the public sphere on these issues by hosting this meeting on a regular basis, I think is going to be really beneficial. So just thank you for doing that. A couple of things stood out to me, which I'll just summarize very quickly, just as being important issues for advocates in this realm. You know, the first is just how critical transmission is to this conversation. And I don't know, you know, transmission is something that I think the region and the West are still, you know, working very hard to kind of put all the pieces together to figure out how to do this in the most efficient and effective way. But, you know, given the resource adequacy situation, I think that this particularly highlights the importance of being smart about how we plan, coordinate, build transmission quickly and effectively as needed, and definitely optimize our current transmission system in order to get the resources that we need to where they need to go. So I do appreciate that some of the presentations, you know, highlighted that issue. I also appreciate, you know, some of the questions from Commissioner Rindall and also from Dr. Blackman about the importance of the demand side in this equation. You know, Northwest Energy Coalition has been a long time champion of energy efficiency being the lowest cost resource to meet demand in the Northwest. And I think we similarly look at the sort of emerging suite of, you know, customer side resources, including demand response, flexible demand, as being, you know, similarly very effective and low cost resource for meeting our capacity needs. You know, the region, I think, is really just kind of still sort of starting to scratch the surface on understanding the value of demand response and understanding the value of, you know, customers as a resource. And I think the more that we can do to try to think about how we integrate those resources more effectively, is going to be really helpful going forward. It's encouraging to see pilot programs, and it's encouraging to see those, being successful, demonstrating results and moving forward to scale up. And I think, I guess my ask is like, let's just stay the course and try to figure out how we can better develop those resources in order to, save customers money on what is looking like it's going to be some pretty significant capacity resource needs going forward. I also just want to say a little bit about what I perceive as being a critical set of public data about water availability and climate change that is really just absolutely critical for our utilities. And I say this, I think this is just broadly applicable, both in the consumer-owned utilities and for the investor-owned utilities. Rely a lot on NOAA, federal data sets in order to really figure out what our needs are going to be going forward. And I think it is, it's a public benefit having that data publicly available. And I would just encourage, everyone who's on this call who cares about this issue to really think about, what can we do to keep that data in the public realm. I think it's going to be really important going forward, and it's going to continue to be necessary in order for us to do the kinds of forecasting and analysis that we saw in some of the presentations today. So with that, I'll in my comments, but again, thank you so much for this really informative session, and look forward to seeing it continue.
Thank you, Lauren. Do we have any other public comments or Glenn, a response?
This is not a response, but because the chat isn't very visible to those of us in the room, and maybe to I don't know if it'd be around once the recording is closed. There was one comment, the commenter didn't want to say it out loud, but I'll go ahead and read it kind of for the benefit of the group. This is from Blake Scherer, who's a senior engineer at Benton Public Utility District. Blake said, the continued implementation of CETA is itself a risk to utility resource adequacy and affordability, especially penalizing the use of dispatchable natural gas resources and promoting the overbuild of non-dispatchable transmission-dependent land-intensive wind and solar resources. Reminder that CETA legislation contains language allowing the governor to suspend or delay implementation of this chapter or exempt an electric utility from paying the administrative penalty if the report submitted to the legislature under RCW 19-405-080 demonstrates adverse system reliability impacts from the implementation of CETA. Report is due every 4 years. The first report pretty much said too early to tell, and the next report is due January 1st, 2028. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, for capturing that for the public record. Do we have any other comments from the room? Yes, please.
Nicholas Garcia again with Waputa. I didn't say this when I came up last time, and I wanted to, first of all, thank everyone for this meeting, and I really appreciate the moving to a 3-meeting schedule. I think especially the long-term planning is going to be really important. And I just want to emphasize at this point that, resource adequacy has a real economic component. One of the things I've been working on personally in legislative sessions is low-income assistance and how to make sure that the low-income customers aren't unduly burdened. And we have direct experience when we have resource adequacy challenges of very, very high costs being borne by utilities. And for COUs, for consumer-owned utilities, we have to pass those costs directly on to our customers. And the example we have is from the problem a year ago, January, and estimates I've seen suggested that scarcity pricing resulted in a $300 million additional cost to energy, plus another $125, $130 million cost in transmission that moved from Washington State to other places. So I just really want to emphasize that this is really, really important. It's really important for our utilities and for all of our customers, and especially our low-income customers. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments in the room or online? If you're online, please raise your hand to indicate you have a comment. Okay, seeing none, I'll turn it back to the Heather.
Thank you so much for bringing in that cost factor and everyone who offered public comment right now and throughout the day. Much appreciated. So we would like our hosts here to reflect some of what they heard. And after that, we will talk about next steps briefly. Would we like to start with? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who presented especially, and for the level of engagement that we got from members of the audience, both here and online. I agree it's been a really good step to take a moment and look at this summer and see how things look for this summer. It's somewhat daunting to think about that the summer assessment that we rely on the most from the WEC group, you know, it takes long enough for that to be put together that the climate information that we saw from the state and from BPA, you know, can't really even be reflected in that. And so it's just such a dynamic situation that we're in when we are at the margin in terms of our, you know, the operation of our power system. So it really is important that we stay on top of it. And I'm heartened to see that people are doing that. They're working hard to make sure that we have the information and the resources as much as possible to keep things going for everybody. So thank you all for your work on this.
I'll just join in the thanks. And I really, on that last comment, particularly from the public, of bringing it back to affordability, energy burden issues, it is a reminder that we've had great engagement here, and I want to thank everybody for that. But really, it is about the people who aren't in this room, the millions of customers that the utilities serve, and the millions of folks that we work to protect through the work that we do here at the Commission. So I really appreciate it coming back to that, but do want to particularly thank Heather, Peyton, Austin, and everybody on the staff here at the UTC for putting together a great event here that gets a great and important conversation going. The thing that I've learned, or the things I took away, I'm just going through my notes here. If normal conditions were generally good. If extreme conditions for a short time were generally okay. And there's an important distinction between those two. If it's extreme for a long time, we have concerns. And then what I've also learned is that the likelihood of extreme for a long time is higher than normal. And so we're in this risky period for resource adequacy. And of course, we'll have more discussion on the wildfire issue a little bit later today, but that seems to be the biggest concern on the extreme for a long time perspective. I do appreciate that we continue to grow programs for resource adequacy. We learned a lot more about how we're thinking about that, how we're growing those programs and learning more every cycle through that. I appreciate that markets, which we see coming here on the day ahead side, will have some impact for optimizing some of the resources here so that we can increase resource adequacy in general. A big opportunity for technology in this space, thinking about the demand side and the VPPs. And I think just there's a lot more technology as well, though, as we learned from Big Bend, the enabling conditions for a lot of that technology, like fiber, still needs to be built out in some parts of the state. I agree with Lauren's comment earlier that another piece we've learned here is how essential transmission is, and just the planning, development, all of that needs to accelerate the optimization of the grid that we have. I think we also need to continue to think about some of the timelines we heard today are not uncommon for new transmission development. I'll also state some concerns about looking at new transmission and saying we're going to take that out of the equation to serve new large loads. A lot of that has been planned for a long time. And I get the idea, I get the concept of trying to say we're trying to take the large loads and not have a rate impact on everybody else. But the time and effort that goes into planning transmission is an externality that we need to consider. And that just struck me today. I know that's a different issue than the one we're talking about today, but that's one that came up. End of day, all of this is interconnected, whether it's water for food or water for power, whether it's BPA's connections to our IOUs, whether it's any of this other interconnectedness that we see throughout the region. The need for coordination and collaboration has obviously never been more important. So this forum is one of many I hope to continue these conversations in, and that need for coordination on the data exchange as well, as we see risks to some of that data going away. I think even whether that data is here or not, the importance of data exchange will continue to be front of mind for us here as we think about the opportunities we have to increase resource adequacy and decrease the burden on customers in the long run.
Thank you to everybody for participating, and to staff. I was saying to Heather earlier, okay, we're not going back. It's going to be at least 3 times, a year now, because this is really important. I will say that we're here, as I mentioned at the outset, as a legislative directive, right? This is how this started. And I want to recognize the legislators on the phone as well, and to say that we are creatures of statute up here. And we follow the law, and you set the law. And I recognize Kate Bronze from the governor's office is here as well. And this resource adequacy is on everybody's mind, as is affordability, as is clean. But it's just, it's really important for us, and we get that, and we look forward to having these on a regular basis. I want to give credit to Commissioner Rendall, who's the one who, as a lawyer, read the statute and said, wait a minute, we're not bound to do this one time. We can do this, as many times. We'll stick with 3 for now, but there's, we may go bigger, in the future, but for now 3. But anyway, thank you everybody for participating. Thanks.
Well, and thank you for that, Commissioner Dumit. But I give credit to the commenters from the last year of this resource adequacy discussion who said we need more. And then with the events in January and seeing the events in the summer, that really there's just more of a conversation to be had here. So I think the message for me is there's no one thing that's going to help us get out of this issue. The coordination, the communication, in the short term, I really do think it's demand and customers that are going to help us get through this, because we can't build things fast enough to meet the need. But that doesn't mean we take our foot off the pedal on building things, whether it is transmission, generation of all kinds, pipes, wires, we need it all, because the demand is increasing. Customers value that reliability. It is life or death, not just growing food, but it is life or death in many situations, whether it's heat or cold, that people have power. And we are very cognizant of that, the agencies here at the table. And so this conversation needs to continue, and we need to make sure we're doing everything we can on all different fronts, using, I hate to use that, tired term, but all the tools in our toolbox, we got to keep using them to make sure that we are providing this important resource to customers.
Thank you for those wrap-up comments, and agreed, part of the reason that we're here is how clear the message was last year. And so much has happened since then. So please do continue to show up. We really, really appreciate folks being here in person, joining us on Zoom, and listening in and providing your feedback. We are listening. Some next steps here. I think there are a couple questions in chat that have been unanswered, and we do plan on responding to all questions that were asked, although the response may be within the meeting summary that we are required to provide by statute. So a meeting summary, which is a written thing and a recording, will be posted within a couple months to the UTC's resource adequacy webpage, as well as the docket for this, which is 210096. We have already scheduled our next resource adequacy meeting for this year. This will be more what we're used to. So today was a little more operational, summer readiness. This will be focused on the longer term. For the afternoon of September 22nd, not at 8 in the morning. And we will post, not at 8:15 in the morning either. We will post notice and agenda by the end of August for this meeting. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that some of you are here for the recessed open meeting on wildfire mitigation plans. So I'm making sure everyone knows that's happening. Starts at 1:30 p.m. in this room. And this will just cover investor-owned utility wildfire mitigation plans. For those of you who are interested in participating online, you can go to the UTC's main website, utc.wa.gov. At the top, the very top, there is a word that says calendar, and you click on calendar, and today's date will show, and then there's a link to jump in on that conversation this afternoon, 1:30. Lastly, last year we got some great comments after the meeting had wrapped up. So we encourage that this time. Here are a couple options to offer your written comments. Option A is using this link, this e-filing link on the UTC's website. And then option B is emailing records. And there's a list there of things that we'd like you to include if you choose to email us that way. Please note, though we will definitely read your comments, we may not be able to take any action on them in the near term. Anything else for the good of the order, as is said? Then let's definitely take lunch and give our brains a break. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.